League of Municipalities. We're a regional membership group of cities across the entire 11 county area of Southeast Minnesota. We meet 4 times a year, have educational programs for cities to learn about new topics, and this really fits a topic that cities in our area need to learn about. Been doing this for a number of years, and I want to make sure everyone knows that we are legislatively active. And so when we find topics that are especially specific to Southeast Minnesota, we're not afraid to take it to the Capitol and have some discussions. And if necessary, we'll put forward a bill. So that is my main role, Executive Director for the Southeast League of Cities. And I'm also a participant in Southeast Minnesota Together. Southeast Minnesota Together is sprang from the programs that SMIF helped to start. It's been going on for about 10 years, and they have, again, volunteers galore that help out, brilliant people. Their issues and topics that they care about and work on are very similar to the ones that the Southeast League works on. So it's very helpful for our two entities to stay in contact. And we not only stay in contact, we work together on various things, including some of the legislative activity. So that is important for you to know, those two organizations. And I will mention too that Southeast Minnesota Together is a co-sponsor for this event today. And so we appreciate all of that. Let's go on to Benya and hear from Benya.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. It's great to see you all via Zoom. I am the president and CEO at the Southern Minnesota Initiative Foundation as of 6 months ago, taking over for my predecessor, Tim Penny. We are super excited to be part of hosting a series of these conversations across the region. I wanted to just take a moment to set the stage for what to expect in this conversation today. And as you know, we were supposed to be meeting today at the Spring Grove Cinema live. But with this weather, the windy and the frostiness and the ice, we decided to shift over to Zoom, which is great because I actually think we have more people able to attend and in the Zoom room today as a result. That being said, the norms that take hold in an in-person conversation are also apply into a Zoom conversation as well. And so I just wanted to note a few things of our hopes for today, and also share, Southern Minnesota Initiative Foundation. We are a regional community foundation that serves 20 counties in South Central and Southeast Minnesota. We were founded in the midst of the farm crisis in the 1980s, so 40 years ago. Our role in the region as a foundation is grant making, lending, and also community convening and conversations and capacity building. And we're engaged in wanting to see a vibrant and equitable Southern Minnesota region where wealth is reinvested and wealth stays local. And part of that, I think, is also keeping up with what are some of the economic transitions or shocks happening all across the country, but how it affects here in Southern Minnesota. And so I know there's a lot of information evolving around this particular conversation around data center development. And so we wanted to kind of get ahead of that and create just a neutral space for learning across our region and have that be open to city administrators, economic developers, residents, people who are getting a lot of information about this and wanting kind of a basics 101 place to start. I also know it's a charged conversation as well, and people have a lot of different opinions on it. So our opinion on this is that we are neither pro or anti. We're just trying to create a space for shared and mutual learning. So as part of that, I want to just name the first norm, which is that today is just the start of the conversation and the learning. Even though it's a long Zoom session, we're going to be together for 3 whole hours with a break in between, I promise. But it's not going to be enough time to cover all the information that is out there. So we encourage you to take sparks from this conversation and figure out how you can learn and engage more deeply. Second norm is that we're going to be keeping the topics regional. So while we will have some case studies shared in the second panel, and many of you may have projects that are being proposed or in development in your own communities because of the regional nature, both of the foundation and this conversation, we're not going to be bringing up specific projects or proposals because in order to do that, we would need to have a lot of perspectives on that particular project. And that's just, we've got a great lineup of 7 speakers today. And if we want to keep it to 3 hours and not 3 days, we need to keep the scope somewhat tight. So again, please just remember that in your Q&A in particular, that if you can keep your questions regional and not about specific projects, that would be great. Third, we're here to assume good intent as well, because the assumption we are making, and certainly the assumption we're holding as organizers, is that we all want to do right by our communities, and part of that is getting more information. So we believe that everyone here in the Zoom room is also coming in with that intention, and so are our speakers. So as you pose questions to speakers or to each other, please keep that norm in mind. Second, keep questions as questions, not statements. We will have a Q&A for each of the panels at the end of each panel session, and we're going to be using the Zoom feature that is the Q&A Zoom feature, which means that us as moderators will see it. And, typically if we were doing this live, we'd just run around with a roaming mic, but because we know that technology can, as you wait for people to get off mute and things like that, can make that a little tricky. So we're doing a little bit more of moderator privilege to be able to see those questions. And you'll be actually, I think, also able to see the questions being posed and where they are in the queue. And for the ones that fit into these norms, especially on the Keep It Regional, us as moderators will look at, you can upvote certain questions if you have duplicate questions, but we'll see which ones are being raised to the top and group them and share them with the speakers. So again, keep your questions as questions, not statements. We will not be reading the statements. So if you want your question to be heard, just keep them as questions. And then finally, I group kind of these 3 together. One is being open to learning. So you will likely hear ideas that you agree with, disagree with, you're hearing for the first time, or is not new to you. So please approach any new idea with curiosity and facilitate other people's learning too by keeping your questions broadly to the relevance of this larger group. And because you might be hearing some ideas that are different than maybe what assumptions you had coming on in, acknowledge that we all have personal bias within ourselves and others. And it's a good opportunity these next 3 hours to try to seek to understand where someone else might be coming from, even if you might disagree with that perspective. And we did try as organizers too to be able to paint a different various perspectives, industry knowledge, people coming at this issue from a lot of different lenses. So it was our hope and intention that we could weave in different perspectives. And then finally, extend grace. We, especially with us moving into a technology setting right now, expect imperfection, both from us as organizers and from each other as we try to convert an in-person meeting into Zoom. Okay, so with that, typically I would love to be able to, crowdsource additional norms, but just because of how many people we have here and that we're on Zoom, I'm going to hold this up here and remind us of this if needed throughout the conversation today. But the assumption is that if you're staying in the Zoom room, you're agreeing to these norms. So thank you. And with that, I'm now going to pass it over to my friend Andy, Executive Director at the Southeast Regional Sustainable Development Partnerships, the regional office here in the Southeast, to talk also about where this conversation fits into ongoing conversations and resources that you all as community members will be able to receive. So with that, over to you, Andy.
Thank you so much, Benya. It's wonderful to see you all. I believe I get to share screen. Do I get to share screen, Amy?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Okay, I'm just gonna make this request. You can see. All right. I see a nod from Amy, so I think we're good to go. We are sharing. So my name's Andy Sutton. As Benya said, I'm grateful to be here. We are one of the co-sponsors for this event as the Southeast Regional Sustainable Development Partnership at University of Minnesota Extension. I'm here because we're actually working with a team of University of Minnesota researchers and really led by a group of community members in Southeast Minnesota, digging into this question of data centers, specifically hyperscale data centers from an energy and water use perspective. And so I wanted to give a quick overview of this research project because it's a way to signal that, we as University of Minnesota and these community partners, we're trying to do a deep dive as quickly as we can to respond to this fast-moving development scenario and end with a set of tools for city leaders and community members to, in the similar spirit as this event, to really help empower folks who are on the ground, thinking about this from a city leadership perspective, even from a community perspective, to be informed and be able to make the best decision for themselves. How did I get here on this team? So at U of M Extension, the Southeast Regional Sustainable Development Partnership, our role is actually to make connections, strategic connections to serve community-initiated sustainability ideas with University of Minnesota resources. So we're really supporting U of M in living up to its land grant mission. And we do this sometimes with connecting community members to university partners, connecting community members to each other, and sometimes there's funding access or connecting grant opportunities to help fuel this type of work. So this work is supported by our organization and also by a group at University of Minnesota called the Institute for Environment that had a larger grant program that sort of could help this year-long deep dive project with quite a large team. So I'm happy to share a little bit about this team. So really the idea started thanks to a conversation with Al Roeder, who is here also at this event, city administrator, city of Byron. He and I began in a conversation where we were hearing at a group meeting of economic developers, hearing about data centers. And Al shared, I have some questions that I don't feel like this presentation really answered in that moment. And so as he was talking, I was thinking, some of these questions are bigger, longer, deeper, and University of Minnesota might be able to help. And this is where Southeast RSDP and my role really could be strategic. So from there, Al brought in some other community partners, city administrators, Bill Schimmel of Stewartville and Ragini Varma of Lewiston. And then we, across U of M and external to U of M, brought on additional partners, Carrie Jennings, who you'll hear from today from Freshwater, Elise Harrington, who really is our research lead for the project at the U of M Humphrey School, and James Coleman, who is from the School of Law. And we are together with the graduate students you see on this and additional staff of these different organizations and cities. We are working together to try to help answer some of these questions about what do cities need to know about the questions they should be asking or considerations, especially when it comes to water and energy use of hyperscale data centers when they're considering whether or not to bring a data center to their area. Again, I shared a little bit about, our areas of focus. So Byron, Stewartville, and Lewiston, there are project leads, but we are really thinking at a watershed level. So we're looking at the Zumbro and the Root River watersheds. Some of the material that will come out of this research will be specific to these watersheds, but a lot of it will be actually much larger and able to be used, taken, supportive of anyone across the state of Minnesota that might be considering this. One of the reasons why we're focusing on these watersheds, especially from a water resource use, is you'll hear from Carrie in much more detail, but data centers, one of the resources that is commonly used is water. And our region of Southeast Minnesota does operate in a shared aquifer, which means that our water is sensitive to pumping. The decisions made by one community about data center development because of the shared resource need to be in conversation with another community who might be drawing from that same resource. So that's sort of why we're really focusing on water as one of the specific resources to try to think about and get information about. This project's also thinking about energy. So we are a region served by many different utilities. It's a complicated utility kind of patchwork that you see here, but also not much is actually known about data centers, the energy use, the impact of that energy use on, let's say, bills of residents. What does the energy use of data centers, what is that going to do to sustainability planning? What are ways that you can actually incorporate clean energy? So this energy perspective is really going to be another chunk of work where we're wanting to come out with some ideas, good questions for city leaders to maybe ask when they're approached to figure out how to be strategic about the energy use piece of data centers as well. I really wanted to emphasize sort of where community engagement comes in this work because we will have an opportunity where we will have an open tent where we're wanting a lot of people from our region to come who are interested in this issue and learn, but really share some of their opinions and contribute to the research. So right now we are working on case studies. This is a plug for the January event if you want to come again to Austin because we will have early results of case studies from some different parts of the country where there's been a lot of data center development. So we'll actually have some early information about what are some findings around water use, around what cities are doing, how they're responding, energy. We will be having a workshop kind of with our local community partners early in January, but we'll have a bigger workshop among a small group of city administrators beyond our core three in April. And then it will be in May where this larger stakeholder convening will happen. So I'll have a slide where you can sign up to be informed about this convening to see if you may want to come and share your personal experience, what you're seeing, your curiosities, what information gaps you have at that time. The other thing I wanted to share is that in July, in July, we should have our final toolkit ready and we'll be really pounding the pavement to get it out to as many people as we can in that July to September range. We know that this is an issue that's at people's doorsteps right now, and we're trying to put a lot of resources to get these materials as quickly as we can. But we do expect probably in July. And so we'll be using some of the networks on this call to get the information out, to make sure that really the work products are available to as many people as we can, so that they can be informed really as they're considering this data center development issue. Among the anticipated outputs, so we'll have some lessons learned from the case studies. We will have a sense of a range of data center types and designs and the different resource use implications. We do hope to have also a state and local policy guide, examples of how cities can really be in the leadership position. What questions can cities ask when they're approached? What do they want to see out of this if they choose yes from a data center development? Then also some public community engagement tools, how both for within a city, but also across cities, if there's an opportunity for collaboration or consideration of working in this shared resource scenario. And that these will be, again, Southeast specific, but also relevant across the state of Minnesota. And really at the core, this is neither pro nor anti-data center. This is pro empowering communities to make the decision that's right for them, that really does keep in balance the goals and visions that they may have for their residents, for the local ecosystems, and also the economic necessities, and empowers them with research-backed information to make the best decision for themselves. So the last piece I wanted to share, this QR code, it will take you to a place where you can sign up to receive updates, sign up to get an invitation to that May stakeholder event if you want to contribute to the research study. It's just a way to let us know that you're interested in hearing from us again. It's also a way to sign up to get the report and the results at the end. So thank you very much. I will be on until the end of the call. Feel free to engage more, or you can also get in touch with me about any other sustainability idea that you have related or separate from the data center question. And now I'll pass it back so that we can move on with our program.
Great. Thank you, Andy. All right. Before we head into our presentations, we're going to do a little bit of that Mentimeter activity. So if I'm going to screen share here again, if you've got it on your phone or if you've got it on your desktop, I'm going to shift the question here now. Next slide. Let us know, what is your current level of understanding about data centers? Just so we can understand who's here in the room, what level of understanding we got. There's no right or wrong answer. It's helpful for then our speakers to know where where to begin. And I saw, by the way, some of the questions on that first slide of, will this be recorded? Where will resources be? Yes, as you can probably see up top, this session is being recorded. The perks of having this actually on Zoom. So you'll get an email both with the Zoom recording as well as links to all the slides that you'll see from presenters today. Okay. All right. Well, we're veering on the lower end of understanding about data centers, which is good, which is why we're here for 3 hours today. Okay, next question. There's several pieces here, so you'll just pull it according to the level with which you agree as you reflect on your community. How equipped do you feel like your community is in responding to the growth of data center developments? So, one, do you feel like your community has a clear understanding of how AI and data centers affect our economic and community vitality? And yeah, great. Okay. Awesome. Good to see this in live time. Do you feel like your community has a clear understanding of the water, energy, environmental impacts? Another one on proactive zoning rules. Do you feel like your community has the capacity to do that? Do you feel like your community has the capacity to facilitate a strong community benefits plan? If you're like, what the heck is a community benefits plan? You've come to the right place. We're going to talk about that later today. And last one's on facilitating civil, transparent engagement with citizens around the potential developments. And then do you feel like your community can be economically competitive in attracting these developments? Okay, great. And give it one more second. And I see folks might be painting onto this screen. If you just arrived, you'll see in the chat we're using this tool called Mentimeter. So I will post it again in the chat here. Oh, Amy already did because she's awesome. Thanks. Okay, and then finally, next slide, the last one here. How are you feeling about the conversation we're about to have today? Excited, anxious, somewhere in between? Okay. And I put this question in here because I know there are a lot of feelings that around this topic. And again, you know, we're trying to be able to present information here at a time when I think there's sometimes a lot of polarized feelings about it, and hopefully create a container where we can engage in civil, open, trusting conversations and with a desire to learn. So with that, thanks for the Mentimeter engagement. We're going to pass it off now to our first series of speakers for today. Catherine, who is joining us from the Minnesota State Environmental Quality Board, and Catherine Neuschler, I hope I pronounced that correctly. She serves as the executive director of the Quality Board and is going to give us an overview of what does Minnesota state law say about data centers, a very high-level recap from the 2025 legislative session, as well as how to understand the process for environmental reviews, the types of environmental reviews, and give us kind of a boot camp on understanding all these terms. So with that, over to you, Catherine, for our boot camp.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Benya. I think I'm gonna make sure I can share my screen here. All right, hopefully that looks good. Nice slide about data centers and environmental review. I will be talking a little generally, but most of my focus here is going to be about the environmental review program, because that is a core part of the Environmental Quality Board's mission. So if you haven't heard of the board, we are kind of a niche agency, and I will say I've only been in my role just about almost 3 years, so I'm still learning all the things about the board and the programs. We serve as a forum for leadership and coordination on environmental issues, and our mission is to support informed decision-making that protects and enhances Minnesota's environmental quality. Among our key roles that are important for data centers are supporting innovative state policy and program development and alignment on priority and emerging environmental issues, and to maintain and improve Minnesota's environmental review program. So we administer the environmental review program, and our staff provide technical assistance to the folks who implement that work. I think really one of the key things is like, why are we here? What is this what is happening? Why is this suddenly becoming an issue? And I have to give a shout out to my friends at Cure, who were really the first ones that said to me like, hey, data centers. And I was like, data centers? Okay. And started learning more about them. I think in terms of thinking about state law and especially environmental review or kind of how EQB got pulled into this, Minnesota's had data centers for years. And for at least a decade, we've had laws that incentivize them, including a tax exemption for what we call qualified data centers. The Department of Employment and Economic Development tracks those data centers, and there's a total of about 40 around the state. But these are really smaller types. They're called enterprise data centers, serving the need of one customer, or managed data centers, or co-located. And I think with the advent of AI, cloud computing, and just much more use of those kinds of technologies, we now have this idea of hyperscale data centers that are really qualitatively and quantitatively different than the ones that exist currently. There's more computers, there's more power use, there's probably more of everything in these large scale data centers. And we have a lot of state regulatory programs, particularly environmental ones, that may well apply to data centers. But at this point, very few were actually designed specifically with these kinds of facilities in mind. And so that introduces just a lot of complexity that I think we're seeing. So starting a little bit with the 2025 legislative session, and I know many of the folks on the panels were there and in the trenches, and I'm sure we can talk about all of these issues. Here's just a little bit of what I heard, because with that lack of specific alignment and specific laws to address data centers, there have and continue to be a lot of discussions about laws, what laws and regulations related to data centers need to change, what might need to be adapted to fit with data centers, or what new data center regulations might be needed. Some of the topics that I heard discussed during the 2025 legislative session, most of which had at least a bill introduced around them, included the sales tax exemption, zoning, permitting, water use, energy use, including the impacts to meeting Minnesota's climate goals, electricity prices, and environmental review. I'm going to give a really brief summary of what was completed during session and included in the data center bill, which was Chapter 12. I have a little awareness of the details of some of these things, but not in depth. And so this is a summary. Talk to the agencies in charge for the specifics. The bill that passed included provisions defining a large-scale qualified data center for the purposes of the tax exemption, made modification to the tax exemption and required prevailing wages. Related to environmental permitting, it directed the state agencies to do coordination through a program run at DEED known as Minnesota Business First Stop. That program's been around since 2012. And then it specifically required PCA, DNR, the Department of Health, and the Board of Water and Soil Resources to refer inquiries that they got about data centers to the Minnesota Business First Stop. It also set out a voluntary pre-application evaluation of water use for those data centers that will consume more than 100 million gallons per year, where they can work with the DNR to evaluate their water use and what might be available in their region to support their water use. Right now, I know that Minnesota Business First Stop has convened a work group, and they're working on some permitting checklists and various tools. And DNR is also working on their process for that voluntary pre-application evaluation. On the energy side, which again, I'm not an expert on, there was work to help contain costs from electricity use. So PUC is directed to establish a customer class, very large customer class for each investor-owned utility providing electric service. And they have to ensure that each agreement between the investor-owned utility and the large customer assigns all the costs attributable to serving the customer to that customer class. And then they have other provisions to protect non-data center customers. And then the electricity provided must meet the carbon-free standard. And then the data centers also need to certify To be qualified, they need to certify that they have attained at least one green building or sustainable design standard, and they need to pay an annual fee based on their peak demand to Commerce's energy and conservation account. So at a very high level, that's some of what was included. And while there was a lot done, one of the areas where we didn't see any change was in environmental review. So environmental review is being done through our existing frameworks, and I'm going to try to give a brief overview, but it does get complex. So the environmental review program in Minnesota, we're unique in having our own environmental review. It's grounded in the Minnesota Environmental Policy Act, and then we have implementing rules in Minnesota Rule Chapter 4410. And those rules don't say data center anywhere, but that doesn't mean they're not useful or they don't apply. Just a reminder that environmental review under the Minnesota Environmental Policy Act is meant to identify whether projects have the potential for significant environmental effects. That information is meant to be holistic, gathered early in the process of the project, and meant to inform permitting and project decisions, such as the mitigation of environmental effects. The process is also designed to support public participation. Again, it's not an approval process. This is really important. Nothing says if the project has environmental effects, you can't do it. It's an information gathering process. And in the rule, in 4410, there's a couple of key objectives for the program that are laid out. These are things we strive to achieve and what we work to keep in mind as we maintain and improve the program. So objectives around the usability of information, the public participation, and also really importantly, to delegate the authority and responsibility to the governmental unit that's most closely involved in the project. So for lack of a better term, the environmental review program has kind of two tracks. The more standard process laid out in the EQB rules is administered by the EQB and includes all the information and procedures for review, what needs to get reviewed, what's exempt, what kinds of review. But the statutes and the rules also recognize that in some cases, different procedures might work better. And one alternative that's specifically laid out that we are hearing a lot about is the alternative urban area-wide review process. And I will get into that in a moment. In addition, the Public Utilities Commission has processes for permitting and reviewing energy projects, and these are also alternative procedures. Just talking a brief detour to the most relevant Public Utilities Commission processes. Environmental review is required for certain kinds of energy projects, power generation of all types, including wind and solar, battery storage systems, high voltage transmission lines, and similar things like that. Data centers that have on-site energy generation may well need to go through some of these permitting processes for site and route permitting. And it's mentioned in 4410, but the real details of this process are in the PUC statutes and their regulations. I would say at the highest level, reviews required when there's a site or route permit needed, and it can be one of 3 different types of review as shown on this slide, depending on the type and size. So everything has been consolidated in 2024 into this new Minnesota statute 216I, and EQB is updating our rules to direct people to these processes. But this is one area where there might be an impact to data center projects, and the PUC should be consulted. Heading back to the review that happens under the procedures in Minnesota Rule 4410, the main environmental review procedures for Minnesota. The most common processes we see are known as an environmental assessment worksheet or an environmental impact statement. The EAW is meant to be a brief document setting out the environmental effects. There's a form on the EQB's website and consists of 22 questions that need to be filled out. The EIS is more complex and more detailed. One of the key things, because these are for projects that have the potential for significant environmental effects, is it includes an alternatives analysis. So you need to evaluate alternatives to the project. And then again, we have this alternative area urban-wide review process. And just as a brief example, here are some of the kinds of impacts that often get analyzed in environmental review. These are some of what the questions are in the environmental assessment worksheet form and which we would be looking for information on in the review. So one of the big questions that's coming up around data centers is, when do you have to do environmental review? I think one of the core features of the rules is the mandatory categories. So environmental review is required when a project type is defined by a mandatory category and the extent of the project described meets or exceeds the thresholds that are in the rules. For example, these could be around acreage or greenhouse gas emissions or the square footage of a building. And there's mandatory triggers for both EAWs or EISs. There's also discretionary review, and I really want to emphasize that for the local governments in the room, the Zoom room. The rules really and the statute really say if the project may have the potential for significant environmental effects, it needs to go through environmental review. And any government that has the authority to permit a project has the ability to order review when that happens, when the project may have the potential for significant environmental effects. There's some limitations, such as exemptions if the project's already been through a review. But particularly if you are the first governmental unit to act, you can make the decision, subject to whatever your internal decision-making procedures are, to do review and to use the format and the procedures that fit or that you think will fit. So you can use an alternative process, but it's when it's appropriate, but you're not required to do so. It's really up to you. The program is delegated out to government units, and they have a lot of authority and discretion in choosing how to use that and complete the review. This is just a couple of examples of some mandatory categories that could be applicable to data centers that are in the rules. You can see how the category defines the project, like construction of something, an electric generating facility, a building, a warehouse, a size, so megawatts of production, floor space, acreage of disturbed land. And then it also says, well, which governmental unit is assigned to do the review? So these are how they're written to tell you, do you need to do an EAW or an EIS? Again, any project with the potential that may have the potential for significant environmental effects is supposed to go through the EAW. When that EAW is complete, the responsible governmental unit makes a decision on whether you need to proceed to an EIS based on the potential for significant environmental effects. And how you determine that are through some decision criteria about the type of the effects, the cumulative potential effects, mitigation, and these are all laid out in rule. So I know that we have a lot of interest in the alternative urban area-wide review process, and I flipped the words on my slide because there's a lot of words. So also known as the AUAR, this is one of these specific alternative or substitute environmental review processes. It's designed to look at the potential environmental effects from anticipated projects within a defined geographic area. And generally what we see AUARs when cities or counties are looking to evaluate potential impacts from development-based land use designations within the comprehensive plan. And you have to have a comprehensive plan to be able to use this process. So the AUAR reviews development scenarios, at least one of which needs to align with the comprehensive plan, so that the range of potential scenarios within a geographic area can be looked at holistically and early in the planning process. It's a planning tool, but it also is a substitute for an EAW or an EIS required for applicable projects that can align with the development scenarios. And those project types are limited to residential, commercial, warehousing, and light industrial development. So I think you really have to think of this process as sort of moving from the more general idea of development scenarios to then finding the specific projects that will happen. So you may have reviewed a scenario with a certain amount of potential residential development. And now when the project comes forward to build those residential development, if it was properly reviewed in the AUAR, it may not need additional environmental review. But if a project is proposed that triggers a mandatory category that is excluded from AUAR, so many of the more industrial categories, then additional review needs to be done. So super generally, the AUAR starts with a plan and an order for review. establishes the boundaries and the development scenarios. If it's called a large AUAR, which means it has a big qualifying project within it, you also have to start with a scoping process with public input. Then the local government drafts the documents, including the environmental analysis, which is sort of a hybrid of an EAW and an EIS. So the content and format is meant to be similar to the EAW, but with a more detailed EIS level analysis for direct, indirect, and cumulative potential effects that are typical of residential, commercial, warehousing, and light industrial development. And then you have to include a plan for mitigating the environmental effects. Then the local government needs to distribute the documents for a public comment period. They need to respond to comments, make revisions, and redistribute it. The final step is to adopt the review, which is then valid for 5 years. So a couple of the key concepts for the AUAR to remember is, again, the applicability, that the qualifying projects are residential, commercial, warehousing, and light industrial. If those are included in an AUAR, they're exempt from needing to complete their own environmental review if they were properly evaluated and the project doesn't trigger a separate mandatory category, those more industrial type mandatory categories. So, and then there's this concept of validity. If actual development is proposed to exceed the maximum development that was studied, then the AUAR loses its validity as a substitute. And so we really recommend that the government doing the AUAR ensures they include a development scenario that represents the maximum or the worst case development that's expected or going to be allowed. Similarly, if some kind of environmental effect isn't covered appropriately, say a project uses more water than reviewed, but not enough to trigger a mandatory category, the AUAR may no longer be valid and will need to be updated. And the permitting agencies may need to look at the AUAR to make sure it still satisfies the requirements. And even it's important to remember that even though this is an alternative, some of our other key concepts apply, such as the prohibition on issuing permits until required environmental review is done, and that you try to look at the project as a whole. I am going to try to go through the rest of this quickly. The EQB, because we publish the notices and we see all of them, we are seeing an increase in AUARs. And in the last 2 years, have seen many AUARs that have development scenarios that might include data centers. It's hard to know, but they have words like technology park or things like that. So I think we get to 17 or 18. Most of them have been evaluated with AUARs. There is one EAW was done down in Faribault, and the little flagged locations, which I hope you can see, are ones where the review has been legally challenged. Just briefly, some of the complexities happening right now is around that level of AUARs and development scenarios. Certainly, the AUARs might be applicable because data centers do qualify as light industrial projects under the EQB rules and the way we define light industrial. However, without information about a specific project and what it consists of, it's really hard to identify whether the AUAR is applicable and valid, or if more review needs to be done. So there's some lack of clarity and some complexity about what's needed for environmental review, and what happens if a project develops within one of these spaces that needs a different kind of review. I think also data centers are likely to come in with different combinations of facilities that fall under different parts of the rule and might normally be evaluated by different governments. If you only had electric generation, it might only get reviewed by the PUC, but this case you have energy and a building, and how do those pieces come together in new ways? I think it's raising a lot of questions for all of us. I think what I would leave you with for environmental review is the data centers, what review might be required for them is likely to be highly influenced by their on-site energy generation, their water supply and discharge, their storage of hazardous materials, and their building size. I think there's lots of concerns about information usability, transparency, and meeting those objectives of the program. And we really want to be sure that we're meeting all of the objectives. And again, this is really complex, so I will just leave you with some resources and to say, please, 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 the EQB environmental review staff are here for questions. We're not lawyers, and even if we were, we wouldn't be your lawyers, so we can't give legal advice. But if you have questions, call us. There's websites or resources on our website. We're working on beefing up our guidance about AUARs. We did some presentation at our board meeting yesterday about that. You can find that video online. And there's a project database where you can look at past projects and see like, how was this done? What information did they have? So we have a lot of resources available and would encourage you to take advantage of them. And I will be sticking around to answer questions as we go through here too. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Again, that was Catherine Nuschler with the EQB. And Catherine's questions you have for Catherine will be saved until we get to the end of the moderated session that we have coming up right now. So we'll have 4 people you can ask questions of: Catherine Nuschler, Carrie Jennings, Tom Jackson, and Catherine Hoffman. Each of them will make a presentation for about 10 to 15 minutes. And then they'll begin the presentation with not only telling their name again, but also what entity they're with and what their role is. And let's go ahead and get started with Tom.
All right. Didn't know I get to go first. That's great. Let's make sure it's working. Everything's good? Wonderful. I promise, Ben, y'all go fast. So my name is Tom Jackson. I'm a mechanical engineer by trade. I've been doing data center design and construction for 23 years. I work at a company here headquartered downtown Minneapolis called Dunham. And I'm also the president of the Minnesota chapter of AFCOM. So AFCOM is a national, international organization of 3,000 members that get together, talk about data centers, talk about data center trends, where we're going, different technologies, how do we continue to improve. My biggest takeaway here is data centers aren't scary. It's just a room full of computers. They've been around since the 50s. This isn't today's data center. We don't smoke pipes and have sweet haircuts anymore, but it's just a room full of computers, right? Every data center we talk through, whether it's hyperscale, whether it's edge, and all these other terms we're throwing out there, it's a room full of computers. We treat them differently. There's other things we can do around them and the size and scale and all of that, but it's just a room full of computers. One of the biggest things I think is when I give presentations like this to high school students and college students, I say, who's used a data center today? And nobody raises their hand. But if you've picked up your phone and done anything, if you've watched TV, if you've gone to the grocery store and used a credit card anywhere, you've used a data center. If you're at the gas pump and you put your credit card up to the machine in order to get it to work, that data is going to the gas station's data center, then to the credit card's data center, approving that transaction back and back. And within seconds, you've now gone through several data centers and back to be able to pump gas. Data centers house a lot of very intricate equipment, data. We're talking about retail records. We're talking about healthcare records. We're talking about 911 centers, all of the internet. Every cell phone call goes through a data center these days. So these things are things we use every day as we continue to improve technology, grow technology. These data centers are getting bigger and bigger and more need for them. It's not just Bitcoin mining. It's not just people stealing data. This is very, very good things that are happening with all of this technology. For instance, if I broke my leg in Florida on vacation, I would want the doctor to be able to get to my health records and make sure they're accurate and make sure they're up to date so that I don't get the wrong information or the wrong medicines or anything like that. So there's a ton of things out there. We don't cash our bank statements from our employer anymore. It all goes through the data centers and all the ones and zeros. So we want it to be accurate, which is a good thing. Some of the terminology that you've heard already, thank you, Catherine, we'll quickly walk through these. So as she stated, enterprise, think of that Fortune 500 company that owns their own data center. It's their facility. They have all of their parts and pieces. Co-location is more of an apartment thought of I'll build the building for you and I'll put all the power and the cooling in there. And then I'll just rent you space to be able to put your data center equipment in there. So you'll house some of your data in here and I'll rent you some space. Edge data center is there again, a room full of computers. Edge is usually smaller facilities, but they can be fairly large facilities. But the biggest thing is that it's close to the end user. So think about at the base of a cell phone tower, you see a little box down there, that's a data center. If you're in a manufacturing plant and there's one server in the corner processing all of that machine to make everything work within that manufacturing plant, that's an edge data center. So they can be very small. They can be 5, 6 megawatts. Hyperscale is the big one, and they've been getting more and more hyper over the last several years. There again, it's a room full of computers, but it's usually a purpose-built data center for a customer. But instead of the 1 or 2 megawatts that we used to do, these things are 100 megawatts at a time, and many campuses have 7 or 8 buildings in that same location. So quickly, as you can see on the graph on the right, even for the last 5 years, the amount of construction of data centers has absolutely skyrocketed. 5, 6 gigawatts of new construction of data centers. So the thought being, where is this going? Why is this happening? Obviously, the big one is AI. People are trying to figure out what AI is, whether it's my daughter trying to figure out what type of cat we just bought from the barn to a chest x-ray and making sure it goes through and gets compared to a million different chest x-rays to see exactly what I have and what's wrong with me. Medical research is something that's absolutely booming right now. There's many, many studies out there that says, where are we going with AI and why do we need it? And when you think about the different treatments and the different diseases we're trying to cure, AI has the ability to be doing a lot more calculations than any of us could ever do on pen and paper. So I'm not saying we need an AI data center everywhere. I'm just saying because of these things that people are inventing and learning new ways to do AI learning and inference modeling, we need more data centers. Right? So in order to compute all of this stuff, it has to live in a data center. Now, because of that, and because of some of the new chips that the NVIDIAs of the world have created, we're able to do a heck of a lot more processing in a smaller box. So NVIDIA, for instance, is saying they're going to have a 600 kilowatt rack. Google here has come out with a 1 megawatt rack. So think of a 2-foot by 4-foot box standing there that takes the same amount of power as about 800 homes. So we're doing so much compute and we can do it in a tighter box. And so what's that has led to is the need for things like liquid cooling, the things like tightening up and getting higher voltage to equipment. So in this case, there's a couple of different things that we can talk through in the liquid cooling. We're actually submerging the computer itself into mineral oil or some sort of a liquid, or we're capturing that heat right from the processing unit and pulling it back with water, because water has such a higher thermal conductivity than air does. So I can actually capture a heck of a lot more heat and get it away instead of wasting energy with large fans and trying to blow all that air around. So while yes, this is a much more complex box, we can increase the efficiency like crazy, similar to what we've been doing over the years. So running through a couple of recent concerns, yes, these things are huge with power, and we know that. And like we've said, they're going to keep growing. We're going to keep having more of them. Since the early 2000s, we've been getting better and better with efficiency. Companies have come out, societies have come out and put some boundaries around things, saying, how do we compare each other? So a great one that's still used today is power utilization effectiveness, saying the total amount of power going in divided by the power that's just used for the computers. We want that to be as close to 1 as possible, right? We want to make these things very, very efficient. We do that with free cooling. We do that with more efficient equipment, better transformers electrically. So as an industry, we've really done a lot of energy efficiency improvements. Several years ago, we've increased the temperatures. So instead of providing 55-degree air, I can now provide 75-degree air. So I don't need to cool it as much, right? So that saves us a heck of a lot more energy, not only from a sustainability side, but from an energy bill side. Nobody wants to pay a high energy bill. Water is a big one that we'll definitely talk about today, and we need to talk about. Data centers use water for toilets and irrigation and all those kinds of things. The biggest water user right now, and why it's been in the news so much, is there's 2 main types of cooling. One uses water, one uses absolutely zero water. on an ongoing basis. So evaporative cooling, as you can see in the top picture here, is those big cooling towers outside that you see on many, many commercial buildings. As you're rejecting heat, it's actually the water is in touch with the outside air, so you're getting evaporation. So what you're seeing there is water vapor coming off, and so I'm losing water, which means I need to pump water into that system to keep it full. On the other side of things, we can do a closed loop system where instead of that water going outside and touching the air, it's going outside through some coils, just like your air conditioner at home, and coming back to the building, so I don't lose any water. So once you've filled up the water in that piping, it's going outside, coming back, and we're not losing the water. So when the rumor gets out there that says every data center uses a ton of water, it's absolutely not true. Probably 98% of the data centers we've been doing in the last 6-7 years have used closed loop systems. Most of the time, it's because the local community doesn't have the water. And I always tell communities, if you don't have the water, say you don't have the water. There's other ways we can do this. We don't need to invent some sort of thing or say no data centers could ever go here. The reason developers and owners are coming in wanting the water is because it's a more efficient solution. So if we can use that evaporative cooling, if we had unlimited resources with water, we would do it that way. But absolutely, there are hundreds of technologies we can use that don't use any makeup water on an ongoing basis. Just a couple of quick comparisons, just because it's hard sometimes to wrap our heads around things. Single star car wash is almost 1 million gallons a year after they're reclaiming it as well. An acre of corn, it takes a lot of water. This is from USDA, so I get it that the numbers are always different, and I'm sure this is some sort of a annuals status or an average across the whole country. But we use a lot of water to irrigate things. We use a lot of water in bottling plants. So while data centers, for some reason, are getting singled out as a high water user, there are lots and lots of high water users out there. But I want to make sure that everybody knows that we don't need to use the ongoing water for any data center of any scale. Noise is a big one. Obviously, the more setbacks we can get from the building to the property line, as the data center goes in, it must meet your noise criteria for decibel levels at the boundary line anyway. But what we're seeing is that with a lot of these fans from the cooling equipment itself, sometimes there's a low hum in a couple of these frequencies. So there's definitely things we can engineer in there to put a box around a box with simple sound attenuation that doesn't use any power at all. And we can really negate those sounds. I'm doing one right now in downtown Des Moines where we have 2 condo buildings right next to it. So we're putting this box around the box so that you're not hearing that equipment at all. Traffic is always one with these humongous buildings. People get worried about traffic coming in and out every day. The traffic after the building's built should be very minimal. Obviously, we'll have some great jobs we'll talk about, but the biggest thing is construction traffic. So these buildings these days are so large that we have about 1,000 contractors working on each building. So what communities definitely need to go through and ask those questions of what is your construction planning? How many additional routes are you coming in and out of your site? Making sure you're routing away from our residents, not screwing up our downtown areas, because it is a big one. Now, it's going to be a year or two. I get that as well, but definitely something to be thoughtful of. Jobs, everybody says data centers have 0 jobs. And I get that once the building is built, there's not 1,000 people working in there. And most of these smaller communities that data centers go into can't support 1,000 people working in there. But the jobs that are there after the construction, which are fantastic jobs in themselves, they're highly skilled IT jobs, right? They're networking, plugging in and out racks. They're changing out server equipment. They're changing out software. They're changing out hardware. A lot of these data centers, the servers and the computers are only used for 3 or 4 years, and then they're replaced or they're upgraded. So there's a ton of fantastic jobs like that. And then there's trades jobs, the generators, the chillers, the UPS, all of those parts and pieces mechanically and electrically that support this have to be maintained. Manual labor that's going in quarterly to maintain these things, change the oil, do the this, do the that. Fantastic jobs from not only the people at the facility, but also the local communities, trades forces and subcontractors. I know I'm running up on time, Ben. Yeah, I am watching it this time. So just recently, some of the challenges that everybody's doing is speed to market. So that's why these projects feel very rushed. The owners are definitely trying to get these buildings built because the need is there. Everybody's jumping into this gold rush. Everybody's jumping on the AI bandwagon, trying to build it as fast as we can so that they can start using it as quick as we can. Now, what people aren't trying to do is bypass all of Catherine's environmental reviews. We definitely don't want to do that. So if there are people doing that, I'll stand beside everybody saying stop doing that. But these companies are trying to build as many as they can all across the country, and because of that, we're building so much. We can't get equipment sometimes. Sometimes it's 2 years to get a generator, where before it could be a couple of months, because we had a couple of sitting around. So it's really done a lot to the construction industry as a whole, for getting parts and pieces, for getting trades laborers, and for getting maintenance staff. Modularity, future proofing. What does this thing look like in a couple of years? I think the biggest thing some people say is, if I build this giant facility, is it going to go away? And my question is always, is the internet going to go away? This internet thing's been sticking around for a while. It's going to keep going. We're in the AI age now, so things are going to be different going forward. People are just learning how to use it more. So we've had some things over my short career in the data center industry where a new technology came out, so we're going to use a heck of a lot less server equipment. That's great. But then we just kept using more and more and more of it, right? Moore's law says we're going to just keep using it. So while there will be technology that changes things and makes it smaller or makes it faster, we're going to continue more ways to do it, and learn more things, and use a heck of a lot more of it, which there again makes that power concern. So over the last 5 or 10 years, 5 or 7 years, maybe, a lot of these hyperscale owners have been talking about nuclear powered reactors. SMR is a term that's been thrown around the industry for several years here now, where people are saying, okay, what if I put a nuclear powered plant and I just build my own city around it of data centers? So people are thinking differently. And that's because these things are so large, because we're doing so much processing, that they know that we're going to run out of power. So there's things like natural gas fuel cells, natural gas generators, small modular reactors, microgrids. We're doing a lot of those fun things. So there again, the takeaway is, please reach out. A group like AFCOM, I'm a volunteer board member. We have 350 Minnesota AFCOM members that love talking data centers like I do. So please reach out with questions. Please ask us, how do we do things better? We as an industry want to continue to grow, to continue to get more energy efficient. But these data centers are coming, and they're coming somewhere. So they're a huge taxpayer. They provide these great jobs. All of the concerns we kind of talked through are definitely manageable, with great engineering solutions and local support to do things right for the community, which we'll talk about later today, which is fantastic. But just from an overall scheme, I'm doing a data center just south of Dallas right now, and in talking to the mayor, he said they're trying to bring in data centers into their communities so that their residents don't pay any more property tax. So just to give you a size and scale of these facilities, they're large and large and large, but they are very great taxpayers. And once they're in and they're done correctly, they give back to communities. So please reach out to me. I'd love to connect on LinkedIn or email or phone or anything else. I want to just talk about what data centers are and what they aren't, so that we're all going the same direction. So thank you for the time.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you very much. Again, we're going to hold questions for the three presenters that are in the panel right now, and for Catherine Nuschler. Our next presenter is going to be Carrie Jennings. Carrie, tell us about yourself and what you've got in your material.
All right, let me just get this full screen. Thank you, Brenda. Everyone can see this?
Yes.
So I'm going to talk about the geologic considerations in, I'm going to say, high volume water users, because it's not just data centers that we're thinking about. There are going to be more high volume water users that are coming to the region, if the industries that we're seeing in other areas are coming into this area. I'm a research and policy director at Freshwater. We're a 50-some-year-old water nonprofit, and I'm a geologist by training, professional geologist with a PhD in the field. Freshwater works in 3 different areas of water research. We try to translate that research into policy. We also try to translate that research into engagement, empowerment, education opportunities. And most importantly, we try to connect these 3 things. We try to communicate between the sectors that are typically separated or siloed. We try to coordinate among the players and collaborate so that people in the regions can drive the kind of action they need to preserve water. The problem we see with this current trend in data center development is typical of any kind of capitalist endeavor is that the speed of business often exceeds the speed of policy. And we know that Minnesota and the Great Lakes region are targets for water-intensive industries as climate changes, as the coasts deplete their water resources or have saltwater intrusion. We're seeing businesses assume water is available in the Great Lakes region. So the other water-intensive industries that we're seeing knocking on our doors are biofuels, that's sustainable aviation fuel, and green hydrogen, and then water bottling facilities. We know that over 20 cities alone were approached in the last year, and that the decisions last year moved very quickly, often under non-disclosure agreements without adequate environmental review. So we started getting questions from city administrators and residents, and they were confusing to us until we looked at a map like this, which is electric and fiber infrastructure in the country. So where their data centers are abundant in these areas where you see that circles kind of vague on this map, they're already exceeding the grid capacity. So the data center development is moving to parts of the country that have more electric production. And if you look at the grid, zoom in Minnesota, the data center requests that you might be familiar with, Becker, North Mankato, Lakeville, Farmington, Cannon Falls, Hampton, Pine City, Greater Rochester area, are aligned with these networks. We see this as a tension because water is not being thought of in where these industries were looking, at least initially. And we do know that there is a need to balance economic development, but we have to also ensure the sustainable future of these communities. So there is a tension that is solvable if you take the time to examine the distribution of the natural environment. But the development process we saw this last year was with tax incentives and our state economic development team incentivizing industries to come to Minnesota and then working with regional planners to site the industries. Then the cities were approached directly and asked for land, power, and maybe water. That this is typically when the non-disclosure agreements were being signed, and it took, if you followed what was happening, for example, in Hermantown, this is a year-long process where they're kind of negotiating with the company and discussing land use and power. These might not be the ultimate users of the data center technology. They might be developers who are creating these facilities that data centers might move into. So there might be gaps in what is actually known about the ultimate use. The agreement is often reached and the project then goes public. This is what has happened last year again and again. And this process, as you see to this point, avoided any environmental review. It was at this point, however, the citizens and other people involved in environmental review typically learned about it and started asking the questions like, is this sustainable? Did you use the groundwater data we have? And so on. So possible adverse outcomes are that there could be potential private well interference with a large water user on the urban fringe. The rates for water and electricity might be impacted for the citizens in the region. There might be environmental impacts that weren't considered in this process, and the city could potentially be saddled with expensive infrastructure. So design critical information on water availability and other aspects of the environment was lacking in the way this proceeded last year. We do have some statutes that should protect us and significantly in the case of drought. We prioritize domestic water use in Minnesota. This is legal statute. Water supply, domestic water supply, and power producers who have contingency plans have the highest priority. And then we go on down the list, and it's really the fifth priority of use where data centers really belong because they are large users and they are industrial large water users. So that by hooking up to municipal supply, they're actually kind of circumventing this statutory agreement. So the issues that we see that were last session or last year was that these projects were moving really fast, faster than planners could react, faster than policy could respond. cities didn't have necessarily the tools they needed to evaluate the regional and long-term sustainability of these projects. The short-term incentives were there, however, and those were very attractive to some cities. They looked financially beneficial. Typically, there was no community engagement in these processes, and there were a lot of stakeholders ultimately that cared, and this made being proactive potentially a challenge, but I don't think it was really considered in any of these processes. So what I'm going to tell you now is what I think as a geologist and as a freshwater researcher, the questions that should be asked. And I'll start with what the usable distribution of groundwater is. We are blessed in Minnesota with a glacier that covered everywhere, and parts of Minnesota, including your southeastern region, that have water available in the bedrock. I'm going to not talk about the glacial sediment aquifers because although you have glacial sediment, that's not what you use in southeast Minnesota for your aquifers. And just to show you the margin of the last ice lobe, this Des Moines lobe, is basically I-35. You're in this region that has the numbers 6 and 5. Glaciated, the truly unglaciated part of Wisconsin lies east of the Mississippi River and is part of this area. But if you kind of brush off or scrape off the up to 50 feet of windblown sediment and weathered glacial till, then you'll find this sequence of layered sedimentary rocks. They're pictured on the right in the column that you would typically see them in. You can probably go to a bluff on the Root River or the Whitewater or something and see some of these units sticking out. You'll see sandstone units. You'll see the ones that have bricks here that are limestone units. The yellow are the sandstone, and these are in the southeastern 20-some counties. The rest of Minnesota does not have these rocks. So you do have groundwater moving slowly through these layers, and then there's some other layers that kind of impede the flow of groundwater. This is a diagram of the two different kind of areas. I'm going to show you kind of this western area where this light blue is the first rock, and then this eastern area where the darker blue is the first rock. So where the light blue was the first rock. You have sinkholes developed on the surface. You do have some of these layers that impede the flow of water. Here's the Decorah Shale. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. And then a sandstone at depth. So this would be forming your river valleys or your bluffs. As you go farther east, you have a different layer at the surface, the Shakopee Formation. This is an aquifer, this is an aquifer, and so is a sandstone. So everything blue or yellow is an aquifer. This first scenario is important because these are places where you have some problematic groundwater movement at the Decorah edge. So if you think about what we typically consider southeastern Minnesota geology, we think about caves and sinkholes and springs, and they are not evenly distributed in the region. The green dots here are sinkholes, and you can see they're kind of falling in a zone, almost a northwest-southeast zone, but there are some sinkholes farther east. This is at the Decorah edge, so you can see this pink zone is where there is a shale layer, an impermeable layer, and it's right kind of at the edge of that shale layer that you get the most sinkholes, and that's because of the way the shale impacts the way water moves underground. These sinkholes are really interesting in and of themselves because they're just like buckets, holes, house-sized depressions in fields where streams can just drop into the ground. And then you don't really know exactly where that water emerges again. And here's some examples of where sinkholes are in these little diamonds. And then these arrows show that the springs that these two sinkholes feed are sometimes very close and sometimes quite far away. Sometimes they cross topographic divides. They don't just follow down the valley. So you have a complex underground system of water movement. And sometimes it takes, here we have a dye trace example where somebody put a tracer into one of these sinkholes to see when and where it would come out. And it comes out 28 to sometimes 70 days later. So it's water clearly taking different paths. And from what we know about the bedrock under your region, we know that it kind of gets down into these limestone units, might flow through the caves for some of it or along bedding plains in the limestone and eventually emerge. So I would say not only should you understand the distribution of usable groundwater, but also everything about this hydrogeologic system because it's complicated and you can unintentionally create some situations that could be problematic for development. So who's already using the groundwater and how much? We know where private wells are, and I didn't zoom in on these because everyone has a well log if their well has been drilled since the 70s, but I didn't want to share personal information necessarily. But you can click on the record, and geologists actually use these records for reconstructing the geology, but a well owner might also use it to understand what aquifer they're using. So we track wells in private wells in Minnesota and high capacity users. The DNR does the high capacity well permitting, and they monitor groundwater use over time. And then the well index is maintained by the Minnesota Department of Health because it is a health issue to have clean drinking water. We do have a pretty good distribution of monitoring wells in Minnesota, but I think they're lacking a little bit in the southeastern part of the state. But these are typically just kind of, it's like a dipstick in the aquifer so that you know how much water is there and if it's changing over time. Um, so another question, how is the water replenished? Well, in Minnesota now it's coming in from rain. In the past, it has come in from glaciers sitting on our area and melting into the rock. And an aquifer is like a bank account. You have to think about the income and you have to think about how you might be changing the way water enters the ground. And if our past climate scenario is going to be similar to future recharge scenarios. We know from models of climate change that we are going to see changes in the distribution of precipitation, the seasonality of it, the intensity of rainfall events, and on the flip side, more hot days, which usually increases water use, especially in the summer for irrigation, irrigation and lawn watering actually is one of the larger uses. I think you're no stranger to mega rain events in southeastern Minnesota. I pulled up a couple that were kind of historic in nature. The 1978 flash flood in southeastern Minnesota, and then the one more recently in 2007, where, this lavender color is getting up to 14 inches down in that area of Hoka. So these extreme rain events might represent the same average annual precipitation, but when you get 14 inches in 24 hours, it's not soaking into the ground effectively. It's running off and flooding the area instead of. So we're looking at larger events, longer duration dry spells, and maybe a slight increase in annual precipitation if you look at kind of the past decadal averages. So I think you can see these bar graphs are stepping up a bit. So are there other concerns with using high volumes of groundwater? Well, one of the concerns in southeastern Minnesota is the existence of high nitrate concentrations in the upper aquifers. So here we have this column of rock again, and these upper layers that are more fractured, closer to the surface, tend to have more of the agricultural runoff chemicals in them. And if you start drawing down the lower aquifers, a lot of times when people are impacted by high nitrates, they just drill a deeper well. If a deeper well is used by a high volume water user, they can actually change the gradient, the pressure gradient, and draw more of that contaminated water deeper into the ground. The flow system has been recently studied by a group, Kevin Keener, who's with the Department of Ag and is in southeast Minnesota. Actually, he's just over the Iowa border. People from the Geological Survey and DNR have tried to understand the ages of groundwater, how long it's underground. These numbers here are let's see, which are the ages? That's depth, the residence time in years. So we're getting up to about 50-year-old groundwater as you get down into these lower units, the St. Lawrence, Lone Rock, and Wanawak formations, and then more like 20-year-old groundwater up here. And it's this shallower system that is still seeing increasing nitrate levels. I also want you to think in terms of residence time of groundwater, because if you're using water, your bank account, if you're spending money faster than your income, then you're going to end up with a depleted system and water no longer supporting springs and trout streams like the Root River. So if you're using water, 50-year-old water, 100-year-old water, and it's not being recharged, then that's a concern, something to think about. This is a simpler diagram to show you that we tend to think of the younger water as being in these upper horizons. Sinkhole formation can be enhanced. So this is the category of, are there other concerns about high volume water users? Sinkholes can be enhanced if they were once like water-filled caves, and then you pump the water out of it, and now you have an air-filled cave and it's no longer supported by that water. You can create new sinkholes. And again, the Decorah Edge is where we see the bulk of the sinkholes. So water table lowering could potentially increase sinkholes. I want to show you that Rochester and Olmsted County have thought about the Decorah Edge. That's kind of represented by this steep slope right here. And it's this place where this is a shale here. The water's not soaking into the ground, but instead is flowing off and coming off to the right, off to the surface. This is where you get the springs in Rochester, and it's just problematic to build either right on top of the shale or right below it because you're going to have continuous groundwater flow. So these are the kind of geological nuances that make, the area east of Highway 52 not just a blank canvas, but actually a very nuanced landscape that needs to be considered carefully where things are sited. These conditions also lead to landslides and rockfall in the region, as do the steep slopes and the high precipitation events. I want to show you how large some of these landslides are. We're in the South Branch of the Root River here, and I want you to just look at that for a second, see if you can find the landslides, because there's several. There's one here, there's one here, there's one here and there, and I'm going to zoom in on this one in this area. Oh, one more down there. So this is what we call the Forestville Store Slide. We don't know how old this is, but this whole part of the hillside has crumpled down. It's old enough that a road has been built across it with probably no knowledge that it was there. But it's this chaotic terrain right here. And these landslides can potentially be activated by high precipitation events. Sometimes they're fed by sinkholes, like that's a little sinkhole right there. Can you see my cursor, by the way? It's a little sinkhole. And so, if you get a high rain event, a lot of water going down through that tunnel, it can lubricate that slide material. The other thing that can happen here is if you have flooding on this river, or maybe a large groundwater discharge to this river through your wastewater treatment plant, you might erode the toe of this slide and create the potential for more movement. So where large water users discharge their water is also a concern in this region because of the geology, the sinkholes, the karst, and the landslides. Other concerns with increased pumping are that you can potentially migrate any existing contamination. I know that there are landfills in the Olmsted County area that have some low-level radioactive waste. I think it's from the hospitals. I don't know if that's what's pictured here, but there are certainly some known areas of contamination. You start to pump hard in one area, you can draw that water into that pumping well or migrate it. And then there are also some just natural things in the rocks that are harmful, like arsenic and manganese. Not so much a problem in southeast, but more in south central Minnesota. But we still think about arsenic and manganese as being potentially mobilized by large pumping events. And we see that happening right now in the Niagara Water Bottling Plant in Elko New Market. So when I think about the questions that should be asked is for large water users, we're really adding the water demands of a medium city when we think about these water users. It's not just a typical industrial use. And if you look at the Great Lakes region, I know as a geologist that water is not uniform across the region. And I know that the reason you get fewer large cities as you go west in Minnesota is in part because it's water limited out there. And you can certainly see that in Canada. It's water limited as you get up into the boundary waters types of rocks, into the Canadian Shield. So we have abundant surface water sources at the lakes and on our major rivers, and somewhat more limited groundwater sources. So I would caution anybody who wants to start a new medium-sized city to not look at the current urban fringe, because that's probably where we've already gotten beyond our surface water sources. That's what we use in Minneapolis, St. Paul, as surface water, Mississippi River and lakes. But as you get to the urban fringe, you're going to be encountering a lot of private well owners, and a large volume water user will potentially impact thousands of private wells. And as you get farther from the sources of the Great Lakes and major rivers, you're also going to be reliant completely on groundwater, and that doesn't support a medium-sized city, frankly. Areas with only glacial sediment aquifers, that's not your situation. Areas where there's seasonal water scarcity, where it might be irrigated or drought prone. I don't think that is southeast Minnesota. I don't see much irrigation down there, but I would say that the karst and spring region, and especially these springs that are feeding cold water features like your streams, your trout streams, that I would issue caution there. And then areas with these other geologic hazards like landslides or erosion-prone slopes. Um, Other things that you might consider, this is maybe out there, but we now know globally that groundwater discharge is the leading contributor to sea level rise. It's exceeding the volume of water added by ice melt. So other questions that should be asked, well, have you talked to your people? What are their priorities for water use, land use, energy use? And this is where if members of some hyper local organizations, they're often the first to see or reflect on what these impacts might be, but they're often not included in those first conversations, especially if the process is not transparent and an NDA has been signed. This will lead to further fear and distrust in government, and it can commonly perpetuate environmental injustices that are already there. If there's no clear government pathway for these groups, they might take varying routes. Like if they don't know what Catherine was describing about how to complete an EAW or an EIS, they might just go straight to the legal system. They might go straight to the media. Potentially they can navigate the formal environmental review process, or they might resort to public protest. Um, all of those things can waylay and stall a project to the frustration of a developer or a city even, and result in lawsuits of the city. So if you start with some inclusive bottom-up practices, there's less need to revise your plans later. We are in conversation with the city administrators, as you heard Andy talk about, not with Rochester here. These little dart boards, it looks like, are the wells for the city of Rochester. They have 42 wells, and they are up against kind of needing more. And then Byron, Stewartville, and Lewiston around them are looking at, adding high volume water users. Um, the electricity is on these cities administrators' mind, not water, but they did stop and ask, what don't we know? What should we be asking? Should we be planning regionally? So that's why we were involved in this process, year-long process that Andy talked about. Hope you came on the call early enough to hear that, because I'm going to skip through these slides, except to say that our planned outcome is we want research-backed information to be provided to these cities. We want them to understand what their community priorities are, give the city a proactive negotiating position with a developer, and support for regional economic development that secures their water and energy future. So alternatives to using groundwater, it's surface water is the more sustainable water source to use. Maybe not in Southeast. I don't think any of your rivers really would support a large water user. You don't have any lakes or artificial impoundments like mine pit lakes, so you probably don't have adequate surface water except on the Mississippi, I would say. There might be reclaimed water sources that could be used. So if there's a large continuous supply of wastewater or dewatering from quarries or structures or discharge from other industries, that's a possibility. I will say that the path to reuse water in Minnesota is not very clear. We have a lot of state agencies that regulate different aspects of water use. And this is an example taken from a hypothetical ball field that wants to flush its toilets with rainwater. If the rainwater falls on the roof of the facility of the dugout, then it becomes something the MPCA looks at, the Pollution Control Agency, because stormwater can have contaminants in it. And then if it is held in a pond alongside the ball field, then the DNR might get involved because it's a water of the state if it's held in a pond in the ground, and MPCA manages stormwater too. If it's used to irrigate the ball field, the DNR is involved because that's a permitted use of a water of the state, and then the Department of Health might get involved because irrigation water, if it's not treated, can potentially have human contaminant or pathogens in it, something like Legionella. And then if it's used to flush the toilets, the Department of Labor and Industry gets involved because it requires specific plumbing code. So that's complicated. If you're a business rushing to market, you're not going to try to figure out what this pathway is for water reuse. You're going to probably do the quickest, easiest, cheapest thing. I'm putting this in here for Regini because she's the city manager of Lewiston. I'm sorry, you're Stewartville. Lewiston.
Lewis.
Lewiston, yeah. And I'm very sorry to hear about that shooting. But Regini brought up the Lefdal mine in Norway. It's a green option for data center development. This is the mine on the left. It's a very large, I think it's molybdenum mine that's mined out. And they put data centers down in the chambers of the mine where it's cooler, water's dripping in. They're using just the natural environment to not only make the data centers cool, but also secure. So, maybe in the caves in southeastern Minnesota, I don't know if there's an engineering firm in the region up to that challenge, but it's something that Regini brought to our attention as, she would love to explore or have the time to explore. But I'm going to say what I think the steps should be in kind of a more uh, a better paced process would be that the state agencies are able to make groundwater data available to guide business to areas with sustainable water, and that planners engage across their political jurisdictions and use shared tools to guide regional development. Cities consult their stakeholders, frontline communities, find out what the trade-offs are, prioritize choices. State require and incentivize the circular design for water and heat, using the waste heat. I saw that question pop up in the chat, because these are opportunities, not things to just discard. And then the Attorney General could ensure even enforcement of existing laws, address agency fear of lawsuits if they don't proceed with certain regulatory processes or speed permit review, and attend to the environmental injustices for communities that lack resources and can't necessarily muster the people power to fill out an EIS. But I want to spend 1 second more on this planning tool because you have a planning tool. You in this region have the Root River One Watershed One Plan designed across political jurisdictions, all these counties, to think about these things. These were what Root River identified as their scientific and technical emerging issues 10 years ago when they created the plan. And water movement within a karst landscape is one of these. This is a great example of how this One Watershed One Plan could bring these communities to the same room to think about this. And I noticed that it's a 10-year-old plan, so you already are renewing it. I think you were the first One Watershed One Plan in the state. The comment period's closed, but maybe we can reopen that and tweak it a little bit so that we think more specifically about large volume water users in these watersheds in southeastern Minnesota. And I'll say one other tool that is coming, maybe not fast enough for you, is that last week I was funded to create a water risk atlas to align economic pace of development with water security. And this is in partnership with Shared Geo and the World Resources Institute. We're going to start as soon as the governor signs the bill. So hopefully January. Thank you for inviting Freshwater.
Thank you, Carrie. I appreciate that very much. We've got Catherine Hoffman coming up next. Catherine, if you would give yourself a moment to get ready to talk about what you do and what firm you're with.
Yeah, thanks, Brenda. Thanks for having me here today. This is exciting. And I'm watching the snow outside my window here in St. Paul. So I'm also grateful to not be traveling. So I'm Catherine Hoffman. I'm the Executive Director of the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy. And I am going to take about 15 minutes and this is what I want to do with my time. I don't have any slides. You're just going to have to look at me because I prefer that more direct connection. But I want to tell you a little bit about who MCEA is and the role we play in the environmental movement and here in Minnesota. I want to talk a little bit about why we care about data centers as an issue, like why are we involved in this? And I've got sort of 3 main concerns. I'm going to focus in on the energy issues because, Carrie's very adequately covered water. And then I'm going to bring a few suggestions forward about how we can move forward as a state from an environmental lawyer's perspective. Okay, so who is MCEA? Well, we're a 51-year-old environmental law nonprofit. And we think of ourselves as the lawyers for the environmental movement. And what that means is that when communities and groups around the state encounter things that are happening and they have questions and they think, you know what, we think we might need to talk to a lawyer about this, they call us. Maybe it's to understand the law or to understand a change in the law. Maybe it's to work with state agencies, or sometimes it can be to go to court. And what that means is that our team of litigators works on all kinds of issues. We work on water, we work on pipelines, we work on clean energy, we work on mining issues up in Northeast Minnesota, a whole bunch of stuff. And so we gain expertise in our environmental laws kind of across the spectrum. And lately, we've been getting a lot of calls about data centers. And so, like other folks, we were getting a lot of calls and we were noticing this. And we started asking some questions. What's happening? What are the concerns? Are there things we should be worried about? And we started getting involved because as a 51-year-old environmental law organization, our founders helped write a lot of the bedrock environmental laws that were passed in Minnesota that shape our policies today. And so we consider it, part of our responsibility and our mission as an organization to make sure those laws are followed and those laws are enforced. And in particular, in these cases, we had questions about the environmental review process. So the Minnesota Environmental Policy Act, Catherine talked about it a lot. So I don't need to do more with that, but this is the law that requires a study of environmental impacts, as well as a public comment period before a project is built. And, at this moment, when our democracy is feeling a little bit precarious some days, public process and transparency are more important than ever. So I'm going to talk about environmental issues. I'm going to speak as an environmental lawyer, but I do want you all to hold as the audience, what does it mean for our democracy if we allow big projects like data centers to be built in cities across the state without public input, without community control, without a good public process of weighing, is this right for our community or is it not? Because that is the moment that we're in terms of our democracy and our local governance. All right, so my organization, Environmental Lawyers, why are we concerned about this? We have three primary concerns. The first one, let me just say what those are, and then I'll go through them. The first is that there's no central permitting process. The second is that there are significant transparency problems at the local level. And the third is that we have these big picture environmental concerns that are at the state level. And I'm going to focus mostly on energy. Okay, first, no central permitting process. Let me tell you first what we're used to seeing in Minnesota when big projects are proposed. And when I say big project, I'm talking about, could be a big industrial facility. It could be a power plant. It could be a stadium, like a sports facility. It could even be like a big Amazon warehouse. So this is something fairly significant in size and scope. And it may be a little bit unusual, but, we do build them, of course. So what we're used to seeing in Minnesota is first, there's this good environmental study that explains, what is this project? What are the environmental impacts? What are we doing to make it better? What are the alternatives to this project with public input? And then once that's complete, various state agencies issue permits. And some of those permits might have public comment periods associated with them as well. There might be one for water, there might be one for air, there might be one for energy, depending on the facility. And each agency, takes input and then makes decisions. That is not at all what's happening with data centers. And it's been, to be honest, a little bit of a mess procedurally. And this isn't necessarily anyone's fault. I mean, I think as Catherine mentioned, our existing laws don't really address data centers and certainly didn't at all until our last legislative session. And the result is messy. Some local and state agencies have little pieces of these things. The local government might make some decisions on zoning. State agencies might have authorities over, like if they're doing these diesel generators out back, which I think most, if not all of them will, maybe 250 to 300 diesel generators. Maybe the state's got some authority over that. the DNR might have authority over water potentially, but in general, no entity approves the data center or has the authority to regulate basic stuff like efficiency and design, or to look at what's going on inside, right? We learned from Tom, there are all these different kinds of data centers. There's crypto mining, there's like generative AI, there's cloud storage. Maybe there's support for a medical research facility. That could be a certain kind of data center, although probably not a hyperscale one, but you never know. Are we going to treat all those the same? Those are all not, we could say those are different in terms of sort of social value. Nobody's in charge of that in Minnesota. There is no permitting for that. So, and this is an area where I actually think there probably is some overlap between us and some of the data center developers, which is this is messy and we need to have some clarity and a central process. Okay, second, transparency problems. So what's happening right now is when these things go through the sort of local zoning, primarily zoning decisions at the local level, local government officials are signing these non-disclosure agreements. And this is a legal agreement that says they won't talk about certain things publicly. So they may not say at all that this is a data center. That might be in there. They may not say at all how much water it uses, what type of data center it is, who the primary users might be, like what companies are actually proposing this. It might limit them from saying all of those things. Now, non-disclosure agreements can make sense sometimes early on in development scenarios where it's, somebody's just trying to investigate and figure out if they want to move ahead. But these non-disclosure agreements in the case of data centers have been, I'm going to use the word abused. I think they've been abused because they go on for much too long. And then what we're seeing is that the environmental study is happening while the non-disclosure agreement is still in place. And you can see what a weird position this puts everybody in, because then the environmental study doesn't say that it's a data center. It doesn't say what the impacts are, how much water or energy they use, because they can't talk about those things, right? And the result is frankly kind of a useless environmental study. So we've been working at the legislature, and we will again this session, to limit the use of those non-disclosure agreements. They are legal, doesn't make them a great idea, but they are legal. And also I want to note cities can choose not to use them. And some cities are, either through sort of informal guidance or through formal policy. You certainly don't have to do them. I think there's kind of a story of like, you have to allow this level of secrecy to attract these developments, but that's not been true. And that is not true. Some cities are showing that's not true. And in some cases, we are seeing these data centers start to move forward outside of non-disclosure agreements, like the cities have said they haven't signed them. I will say, though, the environmental studies so far are not much better. We're still seeing a lot of information that just isn't being shared, either because they don't know it yet or because I don't know why. It's not in there. And so it's very hard for the community to know what's being proposed and what the potential impacts would be. And that's just not a great situation. Okay, so those are the first two. My third thing is what are the major environmental concerns? And again, I'm going to focus in on energy because we've talked about water. There are, I might note, some other impacts such as a lot of use of metals, a concern in a state where there's pressure to mine, and also local impacts such as noise and lights. And noise might sound pretty minimal, but actually the science on the quality of life is quite significant, that exposure to noise, regular and constant noise, like an industrial site, can cause depression, anxiety, and even induce hypertension and heart disease. So that is a serious issue. But I'm going to spend my time on energy. As we've talked about, these big hyperscale data centers use tremendous amounts of energy. A single data center can use the same amount of energy as 100,000 households. So my organization is currently following 17 projects that could be data centers. I say could because of all of these transparency issues. It's actually hard to figure it out. The result, if these are built, would be a very steep upward trajectory in our state's electricity use. The Star Tribune has reported that if 10 of these facilities were built, those 10 facilities would use as much electricity as all of the homes in the state of Minnesota do right now. This is a big difference, right? And as we contemplate all this new demand, our state has a law that we passed in 2023 that we will become 100% carbon free in our electricity generation by 2040. So 15 years. And we are making progress on this goal, to be clear. Our electricity sector greenhouse gas emissions have come down quite a bit. Right now, we are at about 50% carbon free. It's about halfway there. But what we're seeing across the nation is that other states are building more fossil fuel plants, mostly gas, in order to feed the increased demand. And that's not only from data centers, but data centers are a big part of it. And that's a big setback in our progress on reducing greenhouse gases from the electricity sector. If we build new gas plants, we're going to be further away. And I want to note, within the bigger scope of our climate change work and greenhouse gas emissions, a lot depends on the success of our transition in the electricity sector, because other sectors are electrifying because they're hoping that they can then take advantage of the less carbon intensive electricity sector. So think about transportation, right? We move away from gas vehicles to electric vehicles with the goal that if you plug those in, it's going to be clean energy. We're talking about similar things in the industrial sector. And so if we have setbacks in our electricity sector in decarbonization, that has bigger implications, not just in electricity. A related question is, who pays for that? Typically, when a utility builds a new plant, ratepayers pay for it. You pay for it, I pay for it, all of us. Should it be treated differently when a single user or a small group of users are driving that need? I would argue yes. Electricity bills are already rising. Affordability is an issue now. This could make it worse, and especially without some really good planning beforehand. And I'll note it's not just a plant. It could also be infrastructure, such as transmission lines that need to be built. We did pass a law here in Minnesota in our last session that allows our investor-owned utilities, which are Xcel, Minnesota Power, Otter Tail, to do a special rate class for data centers. And so we're starting to look at that and what that would mean. That could be a helpful tool. But I don't know for sure where that's going to go. They've just started that process. I think sometimes people think that if you pass a law, it gets kind of implemented and self-enforcing. But as an environmental lawyer, I can tell you that's not the case. Usually passing the law is like the beginning of the work. So we still have a lot of work to do on that one. But that is a helpful tool that might be able to address some of those cost concerns potentially. I want to note as well that our 2040 law, this goal of being carbon free, it's a really great tool. Our Public Utilities Commission is working very hard to implement it, but it's not a magic wand. Right now, our Minnesota Power and Xcel, so our two biggest utilities in the state, are going through planning processes to figure out how are we going to deal with this demand. And I have to tell you that they are both proposing new gas plants here in Minnesota. And they're doing that to deal with increased demand from data centers. Well, how could they be doing that, you might ask, if we're going to be carbon free in 15 years? Great question. A few reasons. One is that utilities have an obligation to serve. What that means is if somebody wants to plug in, the utilities have to give them electricity. That's the law. You can't say no to them. You can't say, even a really big customer, you can't say, you know what, you're too big. We don't have the generation, sorry. They have to serve them. What's more, utilities have a financial incentive to build plants because they can charge like gas plants, fossil fuel plants, because they can charge that back to the ratepayers and a certain amount of profit is assured. So this is their preferred way to service demand when it's happening quickly. Additionally, there are exceptions to the 2040 carbon-free law. One of them is that the utilities can buy renewable energy credits to to offset their fossil fuel emissions. So if they're still burning coal or gas in 2040, they go out and they buy renewable energy credits from other regions, and that is legal under the law. And by the way, you're paying for that as a ratepayer. So you're basically paying for electricity twice. And so that's one sort of loophole or exception in the law. The second is that there are off ramps. So if a utility says, you know what, we can't make this 2040 goal, it's going to be too expensive for people, or it's going to risk grid reliability. Maybe we might have blackouts, right? We definitely don't want that. They can get an extension on that deadline beyond 2040. The Public Utilities Commission can grant that. So the net effect here is that the utilities are responding to increased demand now by proposing new fossil fuel plants and worrying about 2040 compliance later. And they're doing that because they are incentivized to do so by the current legal structure. Okay, so what do we do about all this stuff? I have a few ideas. First one, let's make every data center to go through an environmental impact statement. So Catherine talked about, we've got EAWs, EISs, AUARs. Don't worry about the alphabet soup. Environmental impact statement is the most robust form of environmental review. They have to look at all the impacts, water, energy, including greenhouse gas and costs, as well as metals, noise, all that stuff. It really puts the data center developers to their proof. I mean, Tom talked about all these investments, innovation, new technology. That's awesome. Show them you're going to use them in Minnesota. Show them you're going to do those investments. Go through the EIS process. That means that people get to comment on it. The community understands what's come into their town. You can look at both costs and benefits in environmental impact statement, by the way. So the environmental or the economic upsides, you can talk about those and explain what those are as well. And the community gets to see both sides of the ledger and decide for themselves. And then you can look at alternatives as well. So you can look at alternatives for these cooling systems, for example. Second, we need a central permitting process. Put a state agency in charge, create some clarity. And then third, we need some guardrails in the law. You know, require investments in clean energy, hold us harmless in terms of electricity rates, sustainable limits on water use, et cetera. So there's a range of things that we can put in place through the legislature. And so these three steps really give us the opportunity to live up to our values as a state that cares about protecting our natural resources, that cares about giving communities a voice in what economic development happens in their communities. It allows the public to know what's happening and to weigh in on it. And thanks for your time. I'm looking forward to the questions.
Very good. Let's jump into those questions. We're only going to have like 5 to 10 minutes, and then we will jump right into the next panel because we're just a little bit behind schedule. I have 2 questions I see already in the Q&A section, and one is for Thomas. Thomas, it's a question for you on what's the average amount of water use for a closed loop system?
Whatever the toilets are flushing. So in a closed loop system, we're not making up any water. So it's really just the needs like a regular commercial office building.
All right. And Carrie, a question for you. How do we protect the community's water rates if a development comes in? Is that a CBA?
I do think that can be covered in a community benefits agreement. And I think that cities need to think about who's going to assume the infrastructure in the long run, or if the enterprise leaves before the contracted time, you know, how those will be handled. So you definitely have to think about that so that people are protected.
All right. Any further questions? If we have a one that pops up in the next minute or so, we can take them. Again, we have all 4 of our recent speakers, Catherine Hoffman, Tom Jackson, Carrie Jennings, and Catherine Neusch. I have to work on your name, Catherine. Anyways, we have all 4 speakers available. All right. Is there a metric that's used? I'm not sure who this is going to be directed. We'll let you pick your poison here. Is there a metric that's used to measure water use, like gallons per minute or some other formula?
Yeah. So similar to that PUE I was showing, there's a WUE, so water utilization effectiveness, saying how much water is used for the whole building versus for just the IT compute. So there again, it's a comparison if you do go down the water route and use water.
I'd like to add to that because that feels like a ratio that doesn't really have a unit on associated with it. So it's how effective is water used. But the city really needs to know is what is the seasonality of water use and what is the maximum use going to be? Because usually that coincides with the maximum use for the city. It's usually summer.
All right, and the next one, do you have thoughts about the comparison with AI to the dot-com bubble of the early 2000s? Who would like to take that one?
It's an interesting one. I mean, there's definitely talk of an AI bubble. I think everybody's just still trying to figure out what it is and where it's going. I think the dot-com boom and bust was a interesting one with just so many companies coming into it. What I've seen even yet today is there's a lot of AI companies coming into the game that are getting then purchased by other AI companies, where we didn't see that with the dot-com bust. So more
All
to come.
right,
And can I just tag on to
go
that?
ahead.
Because I do think it has real world implications for communities looking at these because of the potential of building a facility and then having basically a stranded asset that there's no longer demand for if in fact there is an AI bubble. So it's something that communities just have to plan for as part of the process.
All right, next question. Have large data centers been connected to a central heating cooling system like St. Paul Energy?
Yeah,
Yes.
absolutely. We're doing a few projects right now that do that across the country and here locally. So yeah, I think some of those other things of how do we do heat reuse? We do microgrids where we're doing combined heat and power. We've done several of those where if there's an adjacent office building, we can recapture that heat and reutilize all that kind of thing. So we're definitely doing that wherever we can. The problem is sometimes, as some of those pictures we showed, these campuses are off on their own, so it's really hard to reuse that low grade heat. But definitely we try to do it as much as we can.
And I
All
think
right.
those campuses are off on their own because of land prices. And if we prioritize the reuse of the energy and water, then we could see different siting. And we can look to the EU and even Scandinavian countries. Finland is building one now that's reusing for regional heat.
All right. I think this is a follow-up question for Thomas regarding the amount of water used for closed loop systems and the question they're saying toilets versus cooling. So you mentioned the toilets, but is there
Yeah, so you're talking like 2 gallons versus hundreds of thousands of gallons.
okay. And Catherine with a K, how can a city regulate more transparency with the data center if most of them redact information or use a what we call a shell company?
I mean, that's a challenge for sure. And they will need to, I mean, the cities are going to have to push back on that if the developers are wanting to withhold information. I think the fight we haven't had yet, the legal fight we haven't had, and I think is coming. Once these NDAs are going to go out of style really fast. That's my prediction. We'll see. But just today, there was a fantastic investigative piece in the Star Tribune. These are being uncovered quickly, and I think they will fall out of favor. The next fight will be the developers asserting trade secret. So they will be saying, we already heard data center lobbyists, the legislature last year, saying the amount of water they use is trade secret, and the amount of electricity they use is trade secret. And that obviously would be a huge impediment to transparency. And that's even aside from like who the actual investors are. I think we need some state law. I mean, trade secret is a legal designation. You only get it if the state says you get it. And so that's something where legislature can step in and kind of help support these cities in those negotiations. As far as who the developer is, it's a little bit of a fundamental problem to the industry. I mean, I'm curious what Tom thinks, actually. There's really interesting articles recently about the developers are bearing all of the risk. And then the like Meta and Google, like the big four companies that are ultimately using a lot of these, are renting the space, the sort of computing capacity of the space, and for a period of time that they may or may not choose to renew. So they're able to take advantage of the boom without taking on any of the financial risk, What that means is the developer may not have a lot of negotiating power there either in terms of saying it's meta, or maybe they don't know that it's meta yet because they haven't actually developed that. And so I think that the sort of weird shell game of the way these things are being developed is an issue for transparency.
Yeah,
Tom, go ahead.
many are speculative builds, right? So the developer comes in saying, I'll build this campus for you. Who wants to buy it? So yeah, it is hard to say what is the exact design that's going to end up at the end of the day.
I would just like to
So,
add that we would love to see cities in a proactive position, evaluating with their region how much water and electricity they have to spare for a sustainable future, and then promote that and attract the developers that fit their site.
All right, we have answered all the questions. You did a great job and thank you. Let's move on to the next panel. And I'm going to see who's up for that. Is that you, Benya?
Yes,
think
it
so.
is.
Take it
Okay.
over then. Go for it.
And actually a great segue, because we have three awesome speakers who I think will bring some localized case study perspective on, I think our first panel did a broad overview of both the engineering designs and what data centers are and the different scales of them. And then we talked about the energy and water concerns and what information you should be attentive to or looking for. And now we're going to dive into case studies from both a city administrator perspective, negotiating from the city's end, from a developer perspective, and then also Sarah Meridian from CURE, kind of talking about grassroots engagement during the legislative cycle as well, and what she has been hearing from communities across the state. So very rich discussion. We will leave time for Q&A. This is less boot camp information, and I'm doing a little bit more of question asking and facilitating. So I'd like to introduce and invite first John Rademacher, City Administrator at the City of Cannon Falls. Introduce yourself, your organization, and what about the specific data center project in Cannon Falls have you been engaged in? How's the city been engaged? And I know you do have a few slides that help us kind of visualize some of this. So handing it over to you, John, for your introduction.
All right, thank you, Benya. Yes, I'm John Rademacher, and the City Administrator here in Cannon Falls, Minnesota, in Goodhue County, right on the border of Dakota County. I started about a year ago, which was actually after some of the original engagement with the data center developers started for our community. And in our group is Laura Qualley. She's contracted with the City of Cannon Falls. She works for CETA. She has been a part of the city for the entire kind of stage of when the initial public announcement of a data center development started. So she's certainly knows going back to those very early stages. But as I started, this was something that the city knew was happening. So it was from day one of my involvement with the city, we've been kind of knowing that this is coming. So it's been a big thing for us, and trying to figure out things a lot on the fly, but also understanding what the state processes are regarding these reviews, and what we wanted to ensure was going to take place as we evaluated the project, and whether or not it was going to suit our community. So I'm gonna, if you don't mind, I'm gonna quick just pull up a couple of slides just to kind of give you kind of a background in terms of how we got to where we did.
And John, as you're pulling that up, can you also just clarify how large is the data center project that is?
Sure. So our facility that we were looking at, we did have an AUAR study done, and at the very early stages, they were looking at something that could be on a 250-acre campus that would have potentially 7 buildings that maybe could, or up to, I think at early stages maybe even 10 buildings, but it was up to like 1.7 million square feet of construction. As we've further then refined where things are going to end up, we're still on the same acreage for the site development, but it's smaller, down to probably only 1.2 million square feet for actual development. And that was in part due to as the project developed some of the land use restrictions that took place.
Mhm.
So I think as we move forward, a big thing is what, how we got where we are, and when did we start to kind of really start sharing the information and trying to figure out what happened. What were some of the major phases of that decision making? I think will be beneficial for communities that are also going through, potentially going through some of these activities. And then for us, it was like, what were the critical things that we had? My very last slide is I called it the non-negotiables, the things that our city, our community, we did not want to back down from this to ensure that as this project moved forward. And we were very clear with the developer from the get-go with some of those things. Some things developed as we progressed because we gathered more information and learned some more new things. But for us, being upfront about that was really important because as we move through, I wanted the developer to know from the community perspective, if you cannot meet these requirements or restrictions or capacities that we have, then maybe we're not the right fit for you. And if you move on, then you move on. So, and one thing I want to start, I didn't actually incorporate it into the slides, but I want to speak to it. The site that actually got developed was explored for a couple other very large projects. One of them was actually initiated and contacted by DEED at the state, and because of that really informed a bit of how we wanted to move forward because we gathered a lot of information about that site for that project. However, there were some things that we knew we didn't know, and we wanted to ensure that we had very solid information, and that was really around the water capacity and sewer capacity that we had. And so right from the get-go, it was discussed to do an escrow agreement with the developer, and which would allow for the city to use that escrow money to pay for our consultants, any additional studies or anything that was related to the development of this project, so that at the end, even if it wasn't going to be successful, which previous projects weren't, there's a lot of uncertainty as we're exploring and trying to find out and determine whether this project is going to work within the non-negotiables that we had. We didn't want to be left with spending thousands of dollars of the city's money to try to determine those things. So that was really important and valuable from the developer to recognize that as well and be very open and willing to help fund that. So, that was, I kind of missed that inclusion, but I wanted to emphasize that point because it really, in the end for us, it really helped in the negotiation process. So as you can see, back in October was kind of the first announcements. We knew this was a site that was going to be annexed, and we knew it was going to require an AUAR right from the get-go. And it was going to be a large-scale AUAR, so we actually had a public comment period for the scoping plan, as well as a public comment period on the AUAR itself. I felt with the process of the AUAR, it was very, very widespread in terms of everything that it was analyzing, much to what Catherine was speaking to what an EIS does. I thought that they definitely evaluated a lot of those different aspects, power, the electricity, the emissions, the water, the migratory animals, the archaeological records from the area. A variety of different things went into that study, which also then helped us guide the documents that we ultimately came to an agreement with as we move through this timeline. So really about that May, June was when we really started ramping up the more of the conversations. Throughout all of this, we had a number of, I think it ended up being 7 different joint work sessions with either the council and planning commission in the community. We had actually previous slide, there was a community meeting hosted by the developer. Tract was the developer for our project. That was held in April, right at the time when the public comment period was before the public comment period was starting. So we had probably 80 to 100 people come to that community meeting and received a lot of information from the developer. So as we move forward, all of these joint work sessions were public, they were recorded, not maybe decisions weren't made at those meetings, but it was really to try to ensure that as we progress, like that information was made out into the public and informed to everybody. So as we've finished, we do YouTube, record our meetings and then post them to YouTube. A lot of times we were able to live stream. Some we weren't able to live stream just to technology issue at the time, but that's been corrected. So you can still find them on our site, and we tried to post to some of the critical ones that had a lot of really valuable information as we came to, discover and learn more about what the specifics were. But then as we kind of final through, we did have to do an ordinance amendment, and I think this is a critical step as well for us. We did not have data centers as a defined use anywhere within our ordinance structure. So as we crafted that, we did it on the basis that data centers could be utilized as a conditional use, which creates an increased level of authority for the city to permit or revoke permits if conditions are not met. So with that, we were very much emphasizing that, recognizing, yes, there isn't maybe one overarching organization that reviews, evaluates, and permits these things. It is a lot of different folks. One of the consultants and consultant engineers talked about 34 potential agencies that are going to have a part of the review in this process. And we wanted to ensure that those all needed to be met as the developments were going to be moving forward. So as we said, evaluated the project and created the land use regulations and ultimately the development agreement for what we were going to allow to take place within our community. That recognition that there's still additional approvals that are going to need to be made and done not just at the local level but the state level after the fact. Those all needed to ensure that they were going to take place, or the potential for revoking the CUP was going to be could be invoked. So, it's the September, October, a lot of things happening as we get into those final stages for the land use and development agreements. And then community benefit agreement was brought up. You can kind of almost look at that as the association between what we defined as our development agreement and what ultimately created some of those community benefit things for us. And I can speak more to those specific terms a little bit later. So here's where I think for us and any city that maybe potentially is going to look at these, or any government agency that would have an impact in looking at this, you're for a city for sure, you're likely going to have to look at potentially annexation because of where these developments might be. They're not likely going to be in your central downtown district because of the large scope of them. You may not have industrial parks that have the adequate space to host very large ones. The AUAR process that we went through was known to us right away that this was going to be required. This was brought up very early in the public engagement about this project. We actually did the RGU agreement because the study was going to start before the annexation was complete, which is a valid process. This is not something to try to pass the buck, but the land being in the township, ultimately getting annexed into the city, the AUAR process does allow for that transfer through a joint resolution between government agencies for that responsible government unit. So we had that completed in advance of moving forward with the AUAR. Then for us, I think this was a really critical and positive thing, and where that escrow agreement came in super well was we wanted to understand what our existing city capacity had for very specifically the water and sewer needs, because as we heard, or it was indicated from the developer, that interest in water was important. And this was the point in which we said we need to verify what this is. We want to do a thorough study. We want our engineers to do this, not yours. So with that, we did amend our escrow agreement to pay for these studies. So the developer agreed to that, and it were about $32,000 of studies to study both our water distribution systems as well as our wastewater equipment and capacity. So this really helped kind of set the tone for further negotiations in terms of what those development agreement things were going to be and what the capacity for water use was. So we then said, this is our kind of a line in the sand. If you want anything from the city and you don't want to pay for additional infrastructure, that you are going to cover this cost, you are going to work within the confines of our capacity. And that isn't just the confines of our capacity as what this study is saying. We have, up to 100 million gallons of water a year that we can allocate. We are preserving that portion of that. We are planning for growth and development within our community to ensure that we're not sacrificing our future just to give capacity to you, which may be tied up for decades and may not be in a development that comes to your fullest fruitions of what you're asking for. So we wanted to ensure that we knew what an additional allotment would be, and anything beyond that needed to come with payment for any infrastructure development that would need to take place in order to provide that capacity, added capacity. Then it was really involved in determining the land use applications. That was for us is the regulatory zoning rules. There are additional processes to that, going from the development of that CUP amendment for data centers to plan unit developments, which overlay different restrictions, which actually create more restrictive land use on our sites for an industrial zoned area. It does also create a little bit added flexibility or leniency in some regards. Specifically for us, it was around building height and fence height. Those are really the two, only the two where we got very specifically more lax. The rest of it got more restrictive, establishing far greater setbacks and establishing larger, higher level of landscaping plan and plantings and other things that could create this vegetative buffer, because where the site is going to be developed, there is a residential neighborhood nearby with about 15 total homes. So we wanted to, they're not in the city limits, but we were mindful in our conversations with the township to ensure that they were protected as well as they could be. Then, we moved into also, or kind of simultaneously, once the land use had been started, moving into those development agreements in terms of determining what is your ask for water for distribution and what is your ask for water treatment as that water is completed. So, what are, and how are those going to fit within our capacity? Then we had our series of public hearings as well that you'll have to likely go through. So addition to the CUP PUD, our ordinances created created limitations in the terms of the time in which a project gets approval and it has to be complete. This project is planned in phases that could go for 10 years, which our restriction was 1 year for certain planned unit development approvals. So we needed to create those variances to allow for the phase development to take place over time. So that's really where the areas in which variances came into play. So, moving outside of what our rules state, specifically for this project. And then the finals were with the plat and then the rezoning of the property, because as something came in, we have a process in which it's rezoned. So really those other hearings are very, very formal. The crux of it was really in that CUP negotiations, the PUD negotiations, and then the variances that were going to be allotted. Once those complete the planning commission, then it moves into the discussions that happened at the council level. So those are, kind of the critical things, but a lot of them, as you saw in the timeline, may have happened at different times or multiple times, even when we're dealing with ordinance amendment. So for us, again, the interest in investing in that site, we wanted to make sure that the impact was not going to be detrimental to our community. That was, determined very heavily in terms of the understanding for water use and sewer capacity for treating that water. Those are the things that we would be providing as the utility owner. We do not have a municipal electric utility. Dakota Electric is a co-op that will be serving this site. So they were involved in conversations with the developer as long as we had been, and potentially earlier. So there's a lot that they had to work through with them. But in the end, what we wanted to ensure is that our ratepayers were not going to be paying for this. They came to us. We did not seek them out. They came to the city. They're looking at developing this site, and they're upfront about it being a data center. We wanted to ensure, can you stay within these capacities? Because then that doesn't add infrastructure costs. There is infrastructure that will need to be built because it is in a newly annexed area, so we don't have mains and other pipe in the ground to necessarily serve that. They are 100% paying for that in terms of the development agreement. There's different right-of-way accesses that they need for turn lanes and getting onto the site, as it's just a field right now with a couple limited access points. So as it gets developed, it needed further. So those need to be paid for by the developer. And then for us, where we kind of went above and beyond with them is that one of the things that came out and was identified wasn't necessarily because of the project, but this area of our community for our water distribution is not served from gravity-fed water storage tanks or a water tower or an in-ground tank. It is actually from booster pumps that come right off of our wells, which aren't too far. So that zone is pressurized through booster pumps, not through gravity-fed towers, which created for us, we thought was an area of risk, especially when we're talking about large-scale development and the access to fire protection that creates. So what we asked for was that as this development moves forward, we would like to see a water tower built. Would you dedicate an area of land for us to build that tower? And that was agreed upon. And as you're, a large part of why this is happening, if you are not, because you are there, we would look at building a tower. So is there a dollar amount that we can agree upon in which you're contributing to that investment in the tower? If you are not there, there's a dollar amount that the city is going to spend in terms of providing water and fire protection and various things to serve this area. Those two numbers are going to be way far apart. So what we said is this is what the city is willing to invest. This is what we anticipate the cost of a tower is going to be at the time in which it would be needed for your to align with your construction. Would you pay that? And that's what was agreed upon, and that total was $5 million. Additionally, on the wastewater side, we have a plant that's 25 years old. We know that it's going to be needing upgrades. Those upgrades are in part paid for through user rates from our existing users. As they're coming in, they were going to be a significant industrial user to our site if they were going to utilize the water in which they're asking for. And they asked and wanted to not have to pay a separate rate or a higher rate just to cover these costs, have it built in. They wanted to be in the same kind of rate structure as everybody else. And in order for us to be willing to do that, we wanted them to invest into our system so that they were paying a portion of what their utilization of our capacity would be as those future improvements were made. So that was what we had petitioned and asked for, and they also agreed to that, which equated to 1.6 million. So we're finally the kind of the biggest aspect of this project for us in terms of just community benefit need was that we knew we were going to receive increased taxable value. That's going to have a great benefit to our community because of the annexation and that serves our city. However, our school district was not going to be a part of the territory in which was being annexed. It was being annexed in a different county from a township that that served a different school district, even though the site is a lot closer to our school than it is to that other school. So that was a kind of a point of contention and concern for the community, and that was something that we really wanted to make sure was incorporated into the agreements. And fortunately, in the end, we said, this is something that while we can't direct it to you, you need to be aware that in order to benefit this community, which you're touting right from the get-go, saying all these positive things that it will bring. You need to recognize how and find a way that you're going to help our school district out because they're not going to see the tax benefit. So they did find a way to build that in for us in this, what we call the payment in lieu of taxes. So very much back to the non-negotiables. We were going to go through our process. We were not going to skip steps. We're not going to go around anything, take shortcuts. We were going to follow our process is to the best of our abilities within the time, resources, and everything that we had available to us, which thanks to the escrow agreement helped a lot because I could have a team with me of people that have a lot of knowledge and experience in areas that I'm not an expert. And that was helpful. In terms of transparency, we were very clear from them that, you know, these we would have public meetings where approvals need to be made. Nothing was going to be done in the background. We were not presenting to the council or planning commission something that, you know, it is all hammered out and done and you have no more input. That was hence all the public work sessions. So they were well aware of where things were going and what we were trying to discuss and fine tune and refine. So that was really important to us. By the way, we had no NDAs on this project. That was clear from set from my predecessor, who retired, and I took over and very much engaged in the same practice. This in our government, we did not think NDA was going to be something that was appropriate for this project.
Mhm.
The other thing that we were just very clear about from the get-go was no direct incentives from the city, no tax abatements, no TIF districts. This is something, if you are developing in this large scale and you're pledging all of these things and you're 100% pay for this infrastructure, we didn't feel like it was ever justified you'd have a need for our subsidies. So we were very clear with the developer that needs to be, do not even ask. And they haven't. And then again, at the end, we wanted to ensure that this was no direct cost to the city. The escrow agreement is going to pay for, you know, if this isn't going to work out, what are we going to lose in the end? In the end, we're going to lose time. You know, we were going to spend a lot of time in these conversations, but no direct cost to the city. If it does move forward, we get to a point where we got through the annexation, we want to ensure, well, and then the project doesn't move forward after that or doesn't get the approvals after that. We want to ensure that the annexation was gonna stay in place and that site could be developed, because back to the very start, the site had been looked at, you know, at least 2 other times for development. So it wasn't likely going to be from the landowner farm fields in the long future or near future. So for us, that was really, I think, important and valuable in terms of how the process moved forward. And, you know, in the end, we did have everything that received its land use and development agreement approvals at the final meeting on this in November. So next steps are we move into final plat approvals and other site plan approvals. So this isn't the end in term. People have asked me, you know, in terms of the project. Well, is this the end? I mean, is the city ever going to have any say in this, or we're just going to see, you know, construction equipment going on? And the answer is no. There's going to be additional approvals. It's now we've set the guardrails, the foundation. We've set the path for, if a development is going to happen, these are the things that are going to happen within the development. And they have to prove that every time that they take these next steps, that they're going to meet those conditions.
Awesome. Thank you, John. And there are several questions for you, which we will return to after our other presentations, but thank you for that overview. I'm excited to invite now, from a developer perspective, Bailey Peterson Webster is the Community Engagement Manager at Geronimo Power, which is working on a project in Nobles County. And I'll just preface this of Bailey is the Community Engagement Manager and not necessarily like the chief engineer of the project and whatnot.
Yes.
So a lot of my questions to you are focused on what has been the developer's role in engaging with the community throughout this project, and how did you incorporate, as you heard concerns from the community, into either the design or the power generation, for example, for the center or for the data center, and more questions like that. But if folks in the chat can also make sure that we're asking community engagement related questions as opposed to a lot of the engineering stuff, because I know you don't have that expertise on hand right now. So with that, Bailey, talk to us about your project with Geronimo Power.
Yeah, thanks for that caveat. I talked to Benya about, I'm a generalist, so I know a little bit about a lot of things across the company, but I don't have deep knowledge on permitting or some of the more technical aspects of development. So if I can't answer certain questions, I'm really not trying to be cagey. I'm just not the SME. But if you have questions that you want to follow up with me on email, happy to chat with you later. Yeah, so as Benya said, I work for Geronimo Power. We have historically been a renewable energy developer. So our company was started about 20 years ago by a guy who grew up on a farm in Mountain Lake, Minnesota, and had gone into finance and worked in finance for quite a while, but had a lot of connections still to his roots in Mountain Lake and would visit the farm. And he and his brother kind of ran the farm operation. And they had been approached by a wind developer who wanted to build a wind project on their land. And they felt that the terms they offered weren't really favorable to farmers and didn't really respect their rural roots. So Noel Ron, the founder, said, we can do this ourselves. And so the first wind project they built was on his land. And the company has grown from there. We do solar development, battery storage, and have recently added data center development to our portfolio as well. So we're fairly new to this space, as a lot of people are. We're developing a data center in Nobles County, Minnesota. So if you know where Worthington is, in this kind of the southwest corner, we announced that data center site publicly back in August, and I'm really proud to say that we have not asked anyone to sign, any public officials to sign NDAs. Our CEO, who actually was the first intern at the company and kind of grew up with the company, has from day one said, we're not doing NDAs. That doesn't feel like the right thing to do. That doesn't feel community focused. So we started conversations with commissioners, and the thing about not having them sign NDAs is they can go and talk to whoever they want in the community. So it does bring an element of kind of compressing the timeline of how quickly you have to go and talk to lots and lots of other community groups. So we kind of kicked off with the commissioners just to kind of give them a heads up 1 week. And the next week we were going around to lots of community groups, having one-on-one meetings, trying to get connected with as many folks as possible. Our MO through this whole process has been, let's be as transparent as possible. Let's listen and learn from the community what they want. I loved hearing John's presentation. I think my ideal situation is to go into a community where the public officials are really clear about what they want and what they don't want. And that provides a really great basis for negotiation with a community. So I really love that. I think I'll stop there and I can take questions later.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are some questions already, and that maybe I'll float it actually both to you and John with both of your projects of energy backup. We've talked earlier about the need for energy to power these data centers. You all are an energy developer as well, so talk a little bit about that, and then John, if you maybe want to speak to your project about any kind of design elements in your project too around energy capacity.
Yeah, that's actually something I should have mentioned, so thanks for that. So we had 4 existing renewable energy projects in this area already, which is how we chose it for the data center. So we've got a solar project with battery storage. We also have 3 pretty large wind projects. So with all of that combined generation, it will be enough to power the data center. And all that power will go onto the grid and then go to the data center. So it's not quite a direct, one-to-one transfer, but it will offset all the power of the data center. Another unique thing about Southwest Minnesota, if you drive through that area, you may notice a lot of the wind turbines out there are not spinning a lot of the time. And what's happening is that they're being curtailed. So the grid, there's so much congestion on the grid that the utilities or whoever's in charge says, hey, we need you to turn your turbines off because we can't take that extra capacity. So actually bringing a large load user like a data center will help with some of that curtailment and allow those wind turbines to operate more consistently.
In our project, it was evaluated, and the engineers and developers discussed that they would look at using diesel generators as backups. And we researched this utilization because their comments were the generators operate very infrequently. They run a few minutes, maybe a month for testing purposes. They're very rarely ever on for any extended periods of time. So we wanted to verify that and have with other data center sites of potential similar size and scope in our geographic region. So a few community down in Iowa seems to be a larger collection of them, and they confirm very, very much these same statements that the generators on average for the year run maybe an hour or two in total per generator.
Yeah, that's consistent with my understanding as well for generator backup.
Okay. And then my last question to you both before going over to Sarah, which is probably a good segue for Kira's work too. John, you talked a lot about community benefit agreements in your example. Bailey, I know one of the examples of a community, what you all have included already in a community benefit agreement is a $4 million trust, or not trust, but charitable fund. Can you talk about the development of that? What is it? What does it go towards? And how did you work with the community to prioritize or design that?
Yeah, for sure. So this is something that we've done since the inception of the company, setting up a charitable fund for every project that goes into operations. So it's something that we talk about in development. Not every project makes it across the finish line, so we don't actually have real pointed conversations with the community about the specifics of the fund until we've gotten to, we're almost in construction. Like, we know this project is real. But once we get to that point, we talk to the community and we say, we set up a charitable fund for every project that goes into operations. And we started out with a $200 per megawatt commitment, and then upped that to $250 per megawatt a couple of years ago. For the data center, just because of the larger impact to the community, we're actually pledging $500 per megawatt. So that's where that $4 million. So it's $500 per megawatt per year for the first 20 years of operations. So that's something we're actively talking with the community about. Depending on the specifics of the community and the project, sometimes we set this up to go directly to a school district. That's most likely to happen if in the area where we're building, the school district doesn't receive very much tax revenue. So that's not the case in Minnesota. But there are other states where, like, the school district receives tax revenue, but then their portion from the state is cut proportionately, so they don't really see a benefit. So in those states, we set up an education fund that goes directly to the school district. Minnesota, that's not as much the case. Schools do receive the tax benefit, which is great. So we'll likely set up more of a general charitable fund that will go through a foundation and be more of like a grant program that people can apply for grant funding annually.
Gotcha.
And depending on the size of the project and like how many landowners we have and the size of the community, sometimes we set up like an advisory committee in the community that helps distribute the funds. Sometimes if it's a bit smaller project, we just set up an agreement with the charitable fund so that they kind of make some of those decisions. So it's very customized to each community.
Gotcha. And I'm assuming that's on top of tax revenue, right? It's not.
Yes, absolutely.
Tax.
Yep.
Okay, great.
Yep. We do. There are places where we do pilot or PILT, depending on the state and the permitting regime. So a payment in lieu of taxes, but I'm not aware that we do that in Minnesota.
Okay, great. All right. Well, then on the note of taxes and community benefit and what is required around community engagement, I'm going to throw it over to Sarah Meridian at Cure. If you can talk a little bit about both your organization and then what, if anything, does current Minnesota state law require data centers to do regarding community engagement, transparency, delivering community benefits? What concerns have you heard when you've been engaging with communities across the state? And maybe throwing in that too, because we're low on time, are there also tax incentives from the state level that communities should also be mindful of, that may be part of the development package that they don't see at the local level?
Yeah, great. Yeah, I'll try and be quick. I know we're really, really low on time there. So Sarah Meridian, Government Relations and Policy Director at CURE. So we're a rurally based nonprofit dedicated to protecting and restoring resilient communities and landscapes by harnessing the power of the people who care. Our office is based in Montevideo, but we have folks working across the state. So we've been working on data center stuff for at least the last year and a half. We really jumped in initially because the Amazon Web Services asked the Public Utilities Commission for an exemption to the Certificate of Need process for its backup generation at a proposed facility in Becker, Minnesota. They wanted their 250 diesel generators for a combined capacity of up to 600 megawatts, which is about the amount of energy for 600,000 homes, or the amount of energy that the Monticello nuclear plant can provide. That's the amount of energy we're talking about. They wanted an exemption from that, so didn't have to look at the alternatives to diesel generators. So we weighed in and said, no, we think you should really check on that. The PUC ultimately agreed. And then from there, we jumped right into the legislative process because Amazon was looking to get a bill passed that would have exempted their backup generation, regardless of what the PUC decided. So right now, we're really more focused on education and organization. So to your question about the taxes and tax incentives and what's kind of required there. So the current law doesn't require data centers to do anything different in terms of community engagement than any other kind of project. So Catherine Nuschler gave a great overview of kind of the different environmental review processes. But I just kind of wanted to note that something we are seeing, as she noted, as everybody here has kind of noted, like the AUARs, alternative urban area wide reviews, have been more popular for the kind of exclusively the thing we've seen besides the one in Faribault for reviewing these kinds of projects. And it's important to recognize that the AUAR, as written in the regulations, as considered in the regulations, they don't inherently have the same opportunities for public engagement as an EIS. As John explained, they can be more robust if the responsible governmental unit chooses to do so, if they put the effort in to like make sure that those things happen, but it is not the default. So a local unit of government really has to be the one to make sure that happens. But just for like a quick overview of a comparison, just based on what's default in the rules, the total timeline for an EIS, environmental impact statement, to be completed is 280 days from the notice of when the draft environmental impact statement is published to the final determination. The total timeline for an AUAR is 120 days. The scoping, generally, John mentioned that in Cannon Falls they did do a scoping period. It's not generally required for an AUAR. It is required for an EIS. For draft EIS, there's a public meeting that is held that's required. It's not required necessarily for an AUAR. Again, cities can do more than that. And then there's some comment periods that both require an AUA, written comment periods that an AUAR and the EIS process consider. And then one of the biggest things is with the final EIS, there is an extra comment period that anybody can participate in. But for the AUAR in the rules as written, the only groups that can submit objections to the final AUAR are state agencies and the Met Council. So just based on the rules, they are different. They can be more similar. And John's not the only one I've heard that from. I've heard it from a great county attorney who works on this kind of stuff as well. But it's not inherent to the system as it is. And then I think also related to that, the tax incentives are not tied to any of these things. I know that, Tom mentioned that data centers pay taxes, can be really great on that, but it really does depend on the state. So some states do actually offer property tax exemptions for data centers. That's not the case so far here in Minnesota, but we do allow data centers to claim a sales tax exemption for enterprise information technology and computer software. And so it previously included electricity purchases. That was removed this year through the legislature. But just important to draw your attention to the fact that enterprise information technology, that's one of the things that is exempt, includes things like computers and equipment, but also cooling systems, cooling towers, other temperature control infrastructure, and power infrastructure for transformation, distribution, or management of electricity used for the maintenance and operation of the facility. And that's directly from the state statutes. So, that's the kind of, just for context, the tax exemption we're talking about here. And again, there aren't any requirements around transparency or public engagement to receive that sales tax exemption. The only requirements that we have are about the size of the facility, the money spent for the facility. And then this year we added, which I think was great, labor provisions, and then some green building standards that somebody mentioned earlier. And then just to finally on this point about transparency, in this year, the laws that we passed explicitly says that certain information related to data centers is not public. So that's the information provided to the DNR that Catherine Nuschler again mentioned earlier about this pre-application process. So information that is sent to the DNR at that point is not public information. Of course, if they submit an application, that would become public, but when they're talking with the DNR, it's not. And then also the information collected to determine the fee that data centers pay based on their peak demand, that is not public information. That, as written in the law, is never public information. It doesn't become public once they apply or anything. It just is not public information. So there's a lot of
utility fee that they pay, you're saying.
So it's the fee that they pay based on their peak demand. So that was added into the law this year too.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thank you for that rundown of state law.
Yes.
I know we're running short on times, and I want to get to Q&A here. And there's both a lot of questions in the Q&A, formal Q&A box, and in the chat. If you can try to move them into the Q&A, just helps me focus a little bit. But I'll try to, for time's sake, group some of these common questions together. There's Carrie Jennings, freshwater. I'm going to group it under this banner of like, right, John, you did studies to look at what is the capacity of Cannon Falls to deliver on the energy, or like what capacity around energy and water could you offer a developer?
Water and sewer capacity.
Water and sewer. Okay.
Energy.
So specifically, did you model the potential impact of increased pumping to river flow? I'll also ask Bailey, I know you're not the engineer here, but we learned a little bit about like closed loop cooling methods and things like that. So in a region where there is very little groundwater, how might you did you incorporate any of the concerns around water access or cooling into your actual designs for your project? So grouping that under like, what did you learn about your own capacity around water? And then how did that inform your designs?
Quick read the mind. Sorry, I didn't mention these numbers specific in my presentation. I was trying to go fast and overlook that. Our annual allocation for the full phase development is 43 million gallons of water per year. Additionally, on the site, there was an irrigation well, or is an irrigation well because it's currently a field that is appropriated for 41 million gallons a year. So when we were doing our study, they were evaluating where is the water coming from. So ours will be municipal water, and it is served by the wells that the city has, which are right now part of the Jordan Aquifer. So they're very deep, 400 plus foot wells, going pretty far down. We are appropriated from the DNR for our municipal permit up to 250 million gallons of water. So that was really what the study was doing, like looking at what do we currently use, what do we have short of our appropriation, what could future development lead to in terms of water use, and what would be remaining that we would have the potential to potentially allocate to a user like a data center. So that's where we came up with the number, and 43 million gallons was what under the capacity of where we were. If we then from that study, we had conversations and shared that information with the DNR and asked them specifically, like, what do you see as the potential impact for this within our appropriation? Do you see us, if we increase and provide this allocation, which is within our appropriation, which you've permitted us to do, will this create additional impacts, negative impacts in our own community or around the region? And the answer from the DNR was they do not see this having any negative impacts upon other water users.
This is an answer, or this is a question I can answer. So great. Yeah, water was definitely the number one concern that came up when we first started talking about data centers. So the team pretty early on recognized there's limited water use in the area, or water availability in the area. So we are committed to finding a low water use solution, whether that's closed loop, air cooled, a combination. My understanding is there are lots of developing technologies now. So there are many different options, but no, we will not be doing evaporative cooling. I do know that low water use solutions require more energy, and because we're bringing energy generation, that's less of a concern for us. So yeah, happy to say it'll be sinks and toilets that will need water.
Great. And that gets to one of the questions in the Q&A of what type of community feedback did you take into consideration during the process? I think that's probably a good example there, but maybe broadening it. There's several questions around just the process for community engagement, both like beyond the AUAR process, which you know is kind of beholden to a public comment period. What if John, were there other opportunities that you were using to engage the community? If you could do it all over again, would there be other methods you would use? Bailey, curious your methods from the developer standpoint. What methods are you using that it sounds like to go beyond what is like required of law? And then maybe Sarah, if there's anything you want to weigh into of since you spoke to the limitations of what is currently statutorily required, like are there recommendations you see about better and more robust community engagement, and at what points?
I'll quick add to what additionally did. So we clearly had all the formal processes, the public hearings for the land use decisions, the scoping periods. On top of that, the developer had their community engagement meeting and was continually updating an FAQ page that was linked into our website for questions that were asked. They hired a local person to be here to address and speak directly in person to anybody within the area that had concerns and questions about the project, to try to provide more information. Anytime that I had a call or an email related to the project, I did my best to follow up and provide that time. I had number of requests for individual one-on-one times with residents and about the project where we did that. On top of that, that was another component of why we had all the work sessions that we did, so that we are operating and providing this information out in the public. As part of all our other formal meetings, so planning commission and city council meetings, we have a public forum. So we provide 30 minutes at the start of our meetings for anybody in the community to provide their input on any topic related to the city. We heard a lot of that. Those questions were recorded, they were taken down, and at a later meeting, I did a presentation which was very much generated around directly answering those questions, as well as those questions were incorporated into FAQ responses and other information that came out in later work sessions as we got closer to the finer details of what the end was.
Yeah, and we're much earlier in the process, so we haven't been through the environmental review process yet. We are still kind of making our way through all of the stakeholders that we need to connect with. My team actually earlier this week was out in the field door knocking neighbors within a mile of the site and handing out information, explaining about the project, answering questions, taking feedback. They had a really good experience. There was a range of reactions. You know, some people are not as happy, other people are open to it. But they got a lot of really good feedback about, like, you know, what people would like to see from us going forward. We'll be hosting a private event for those same neighbors of the project that will be most directly impacted sometime in January. We've got 2 open houses set up also in January for the wider public, which are not required as any part of the process. And then, of course, when we get into the environmental reviews, we'll be following everything that's required, and I would guess some additional opportunities for folks to weigh in as well. Yeah, so we're looking for lots of ways to get out there and talk to people. We've got a team on the ground now that are going to be going to the Kiwanis Club and the Rotary and the school districts and everybody we can to present about the project and answer questions and that kind of thing.
Good. And maybe Sarah, as in your answer, I also want to maybe just loop in another question that I think really hits at your expertise too. But we heard the current administration seems to be proposing potentially to limit or ban local and state regulation. So in light of other like community engagement methods, even what is required by local and state law around some of these reviews, how are you seeing the role of the federal government and perhaps overriding that too?
Just a small question. I think that, I mean, we'll see. That'll depend on, what I've heard is it's about AI more so than specific things that might be, actual state laws that relate to development of a building or anything. So we'll see. I think on that is the answer there. And certainly anything that was passed would probably be met very swiftly with some sort of legal challenge. So that's kind of how I handle some of those things these days. But related to this question of how to engage or what kind of opportunities should communities be kind of looking for. So at CURE, we're always asking who stands to benefit from a proposed action or project and who's going to be bearing the burden. And then we're kind of asking who has the decision-making power or the political and social power to make something happen. And then who do those folks represent? So I think too often, not necessarily with just data centers, but just generally, communities are asked to bear burdens with little or no benefit and no real opportunity for engagement or, importantly, influence in the decision-making process. So that's kind of our CURE's perspective from approaching this. And so with that in mind, I think engaging people early and often, making the process clear is really important. When can people weigh in and how, making additional opportunities for engagement, I think can really go a long way. Like do more than the bare minimum, because that's what it is. And then I think making sure people understand how their comments are being considered, whether they have any influence in the process. And if it seems like they don't, maybe figure out ways where they really can, because you're going to lose people's trust and interest if they don't feel like they are heard and being listened to and that they actually can make a difference. And then I would say, maybe think carefully about NDAs. I think just generally we've seen a lot of backlash about that. So just kind of what is right for your community at what point. You got to think about it.
Great. And a great way to end. We're right at the 4:00 mark, so I'm going to pass it to Amy Grover to lead us through our closing. If you can stay on a few minutes, I'm going to put a Mentimeter slide out to capture some live time feedback, as well as asking what resources you feel like additional resources you need from this conversation to bring back to your community. So as I get that up, and if you can stay a few minutes late, please fill that out. But over to you, Amy, and thank you so much to my panel and to all of our speakers as well.
Yes, thank you so much to everyone for your adaptability today and switching over to virtual. We appreciate the expertise and the experiences that the presenters and panelists have shared and your great questions from the participants. Grateful to the staff at RSDP, at Southeast Minnesota Together, at SMIF that pulled this together. A special thank you to the sponsors as well, which included RSDP and Great River Energy. As we've mentioned in the chat, we will be following up on this with an email that includes the slides. And as soon as the recording link is ready, we will share that out as well. And we are hosting another one of these data center forums on January 14th at the Hormel Nature Center in Austin. So if you'd like to join us or would like to share with your networks, registration for that is open on Eventbrite. And with that, I would just say thank you again and happy holidays to everyone.
Great. Thank you all for your engagement. And thank you again to our speakers. Let it be known, none of them have received a stipend to speak, so are doing this out of the generosity of being able to share their knowledge. Thank you. All right. We'll keep this open just for a little bit. Thank you for participating in this too helps us to know what you got out of this. There's one more Mentimeter question right after this, if you can stay a few minutes. Okay. All right. I'll give it 10 more seconds for folks to fill this out. At least this slide, and then we'll move to the next here. Okay. And then finally, what kind of tools, resources would help your community be ready to respond?
Before we go, a big thank you to Benya, Andy, and Amy for a lot of time and effort that you put into this. You did a great job, and our cities are lucky to have you to work with. Thank you.
Thanks to those hanging on to give us your feedback. Appreciate it. Okay. I will stop the share. Helpful suggestions on next steps. Thank you.
I'll send my revised slides to you, Amy, right?